Want to join in, mother? Rob asked in a teasing tone as he and Rukun piled snow up to create a curved wall. I'm sure, Lady Stark said dryly, though Ursula was sure she could see the amusement in her eyes. I think Bran and I will officiate, make sure none of you get out of hand, she continued pointedly, and Rob laughed at her. Ursula smiled when she heard it. He sounded so carefree and young. Perhaps he truly had forgotten the weight of his responsibilities for the afternoon. What are the rules exactly? Ursula asked, glancing at Arya, who was building a wall of her own opposite Rob and Rukun's. There are no rules, Rob told her with a grin, and she raised a brow. You will just end up pelted with snow, freezing cold and soaked the bone, Lady Stark elaborated. Mother, you make it sound like no fun at all, Arya said with a roll of her eyes. Here, you can be on my side. Boys against girls, what do you say? She continued, and Ursula nodded her agreement, thrilled that Arya had suggested it. Best we show them what we're made of, Ursula quipped, moving towards where she was and seeing her grin widely in response. Ursula dropped down in the snow next to her, and began adding height to the opposite end of the wall. That's it, Arya nodded her approval, make sure you get it nice and thick. Pack it as much as possible or it will just crumble down. Ursula did as she was directed, even though the snow soon soaked through the new gloves Rob had bought her. She could feel the cold on her skin, but she was unwilling to let any of them down by complaining about it. It wasn't unbearable, and she soon grew used to the feeling. You seem to have a knack for that, Arya said after several minutes, and Ursula smiled. Here she continued, do you want me to show you how to make a snowball? As she said it, she was already scooping snow into her hands and sculpting it into a round shape. This is our weaponry? Ursula asked with a raised brow, and Arya grinned at her. Too right, she confirmed, placing the finished snowball between them before she started on the next one. 5 minutes until battle commences. Bran hollered out from where he was perched on a chair, swathed in furs. Lady Stark stood behind the chair with a protective hand laying on the back of it, the sight making Ursula smile slightly. Come on. Arya snapped her back to the task at hand. Rob makes these things ridiculously quickly. We'll see about that, Ursula returned, squashing a handful of snow into a round shape and depositing it in the small pile before instantly scooping up more. Arya looked faintly impressed as she quickly added another 3 to the pile. You keep making those, Arya advised her, and I will add a little more to the wall. Ursula nodded her agreement, making the snowballs as quickly as she could. Soon a nice little pile was building up, and she increased her pace even more as Bran called out that they only had 1 minute left to prepare themselves. Arya dived back down behind the wall in the next moment. Ready for battle, she grinned, and Ursula smiled back. As I will ever be, Ursula said, following Arya's lead and tugging up the hood of her cloak, as well as pulling her scarf up over the bottom half of her face. They can sting if they catch you in the face, Arya warned her, and she grimaced. 3. Bran shouted out. 2. 1. Fight. At once Arya snatched up a snowball and launched it over the wall towards Rob and Rukun's own fort. Ursula picked up one of her own and raised herself up so she could see, only to duck back down in an instant as a snowball hurtled towards her. It landed just behind them and Arya scrabbled for it at once, squeezing it back into shape and adding it to their own pile. Waste not, want not, Arya said, as Ursula flung her own towards the wall that Rob and Rukun were ducking behind. It sailed over, and Ursula could have sworn she heard a slight yelp. I think you got Rukun, Arya cackled, nice shot. Thank you, Ursula beamed, picking up another ball of snow and tossing it towards the boys. This time she didn't think she had been lucky enough to hit a target. Arya threw another then, and then they were ducking back down again to avoid a pelt of them coming from the opposite fort. What is the aim of the game exactly? Ursula asked Arya as they cowered behind their own wall and waited for the assault to stop. To destroy the other team's fort, Arya told her, and Ursula nodded. And how do we do that? She asked. Hope they built it weakly so we can knock it down with the snowballs, if not, we have to kick it down, Arya told her, and Ursula giggled. I think they've run out, she said, picking up a snowball and moving to rise up. Arya grabbed her and pulled her back down at once. Don't be so sure, Arya said, Rob likes to lull people into a false sense of security and they get them right in the face. Ursula's eyes widened at that, and Arya cackled. Don't think he'll be soft on you because you're his wife. Rob shows no mercy when it comes to snow fights, she continued, and Ursula couldn't help but join in with her laughter. Slowly they both raised their heads up above the parapet, and a snowball came hurtling towards them at once, missing Ursula's head by a whisper. "Told you," Arya said breathlessly as they ducked back down again. "Should we aim for the fort?" Ursula asked her, and Arya nodded her head. Again they rose up, Arya expertly dodging another snowball that came their way. "Go," Arya said, and they both launched as many snowballs as they could towards the boys' fort. A tiny little piece seemed to crumble from one edge, but other than that it remained intact. "Damn it," Arya cursed as they ducked back down to make more snowballs. "What now?" Ursula asked her, and Arya bit down on her lip. "Now we need to entice them out," Arya said, "then you can run out and knock their fort down." "Why me?" Ursula asked her, shaping yet more snow. "Because they won't be expecting you, they will be expecting me," Arya told her with a sly grin, and Ursula nodded her head determinedly. "I'll do it," she said, and Arya nodded once, before she raised her head above the parapet. "Scared to come out, boys?" she called out in a crowing manner, and Ursula put her hand up to her mouth to stifle her giggles. "We are just two defenseless ladies and you are too afraid to take down our fort," Arya continued mockingly, and Ursula crawled past her so she could peek round the side of the fort. "It's working," she told Arya quietly, to which she rose up higher behind the walls and waved her hands in the air. "Come and get us," she taunted, and a snowball flew out from behind the boys' fort. "They'll come now," Arya said certainly, "they will take cover behind those bushes over there." She nodded her head where she meant. "That's why they insisted on taking that side. I will make a lot of noise and throw a lot of snow at them. You just need to sneak into the undergrowth while they are moving to the bushes. Once I have them distracted you can move through it and then just go for it. Kick as much of it down as you can, then victory is ours." "All right," Ursula said, eyeing up the undergrowth, "tell me when to go." Arya confirmed that she would, and Ursula readied herself to dart into the undergrowth nearby, hoping that neither Rob nor Rickon would spot her. Now Arya hissed in the next moment, and Ursula crawled as fast as she could towards the undergrowth as Arya spouted off a tirade of taunts and insults to keep the attention on her and mask any sound. Ursula hid herself behind a bush that still had most of its leaves, seeing Rob and Rickon in the bushes opposite, furiously making up a pile of snowballs. Slowly she moved herself through the vegetation towards their fort. Thankfully Arya continued making a lot of noise, throwing several snowballs towards them as they continued heaping more onto their pile. Ursula took a deep breath when she came to a halt in the undergrowth directly opposite their fort. She was 10 feet away at most, and Rob and Rickon had retreated at least 30 from their base. If she was quick she could have a damn good go at kicking it down. She glanced over to them, seeing them beginning to pelt Arya with snowballs. Slowly Ursula inched forwards until she was at the edge of the undergrowth, preparing to dart out towards their fort. "Hang on," she heard Rob say as he launched yet another snowball, "where's Ursula?" On hearing that she knew it was now or never, darting out of her hiding place and launching herself towards their snow fort. She got 2 good kicks in before Rickon shouted out his warning to Rob. There would only be seconds now before they moved to stop her, and she furiously kicked as much as she could down. Arms came about her waist in the next moment, and she shrieked, her feet slipping on the snow-covered ground. It was enough to topple both her and Rob, but somehow he managed to twist his body so that he fell first, cushioning her own fall with himself. He crashed right through the remains of his and Rickon's fort, landing on his back with a groan as Ursula collapsed on top of him. She couldn't help but laugh, pushing herself up against his chest so she was sat astride him before she raised both her arms up in triumph. Arya was crowing in victory behind her, and Rob sighed heavily in defeat before he grabbed a handful of snow and brought it up to tip over her head. Ursula gasped as the coldness trickled down her back, grabbing a fistful of snow in each hand and crushing it against either side of his head. "All right." Rob raised his hands in surrender. "All right, you win. Did you hear that, Arya?" He conceded. Ursula called over her shoulder, and Arya practically bounded towards them. "By the gods, how did you ever win the North with those appalling tactics?" she crowed triumphantly when she reached them, and Rob rolled his eyes at her. "How was I to know you would use my own wife against me?" Rob replied grumpily, and Ursula tried to bite back a smile. "What do we win?" Ursula asked, glancing between the Stark siblings expectantly. A hot bath, Lady Stark said in an amused tone, and if you're lucky I will have them sort you out some warm, spiced milk. Lovely, Ursula said happily, struggling ungracefully back up to her feet. Thank you, she said gratefully to Arya as she steadied her to keep her from slipping over again. Is no one going to give me a hand? Rob asked exasperatedly, to which Ursula and Arya both held out their hands. We'd best help the old man up, Arya grinned, and Rob scowled at her, grabbing onto both of their hands and hauling himself back to his feet with their aid. Thank you, he said, shooting an irritable look to his little sister, who merely poked her tongue out at him in response. I have been waiting years for this moment, Arya said, clapping her hands together. Don't get used to it, Rob warned her, wrapping his arm around Ursula's shoulders. I think the teams will have to be mixed up next time. So you admit you can't win without a goal? Arya asked, to which Ursula put her hand to her mouth to stifle her giggles. Rob huffed in response, and Ursula calmed herself, snaking her arm about his waist and poking him lightly. Perhaps he has been humiliated enough, Ursula said. I don't know about everyone else, but I have snow melting down my back and I would quite like some of that warm milk. A good idea, Lady Stark spoke up before either Rob or Arya could continue goading one another. Some warm milk while the poor serving girls get on with warming enough water for baths for all of you, she continued irritably, swatting at Rickon as he tried to sneak a pinch of snow down her back. Enough, you, she scolded him, and Rickon danced out of her reach. Come on, let's get Bran in. Rob released Ursula, and clapped his hand on Arya's back instead, steering her towards their brother. Rickon bounded towards them too, and Ursula watched as Arya and Rickon took hold of either side of the front of the chair while Rob went to the back. On three they lifted him between them and made their way up the path towards the gate. Ursula walked on behind them, smiling slightly as she heard the four of them exclaiming away happily about the snow battle. She knew well enough that Bran would likely have wanted to join in with them, but he appeared in good cheer as Rob chastised him teasingly for not telling him that Ursula had moved to hide in the undergrowth. Lady Stark had darted on ahead to open the gate, and they passed through it slowly, mindful of not slipping on the snow. A path had been cleared in the courtyard, and their pace increased slightly as they made their way to the cleared steps of the keep. Up the steps they went, placing Bran down carefully in the entrance hall as the guards closed the doors behind them again. Rob moved to grab Bran's wheelchair, setting it down next to him before Arya and Rickon shifted him over into it. Was this from the parlor? Rob asked his mother, indicating the chair they had taken outside. Yes, she confirmed, you can take it back there now and wait for your milk. They obliged her, making their way down the hallway to the parlor, Rickon bounding ahead to open the door to let Bran wheel himself in first. The rest filed in after him, with Ursula entering last and closing the door behind her. She had never been so grateful for the roaring fire that was dancing in the grate, unable to stop herself from exhaling in relief. Rob turned to her when he had replaced the chair at the small table in the corner, sending her a smile which she returned easily. He wandered towards her in the next moment, his hands coming to the fastening of her cloak. You're not too cold, are you? He asked her, and she shook her head. Nothing that a bath and that warm milk your mother has promised us won't fix, she assured him, and his smile widened as he swept her damp cloak off her shoulders. Settle yourself down, he urged her, laying the cloak over the back of one of the chairs where everyone else seemed to have deposited theirs. He made to remove his own then as Ursula moved to settle herself on the sofa, pulling her dripping gloves from her hands as she did so. The numbness in her hands was beginning to fade now, and the sudden warmth surrounding her was making them sting. Rob settled next to her in a moment, reaching out for one of her hands and rubbing it between his own. Getting them warmed up again can be the worst part, he said knowingly, but you'll be fine in a little while. No doubt, she agreed with him, smiling widely when he placed a kiss to the back of her hand. Arya commented, rolling her eyes. Rob merely hushed her, and Ursula smiled, glad that Arya was being more herself around her now, instead of being overly polite and guarded. Can we play another game later? Rickon asked, looking hopefully towards his older brother. Perhaps, Rob said, but not out in the snow, it will be going dark soon enough. Perhaps I can see about us dining as a family instead of in the hall, and afterwards we can play a few rounds of cards. That sounds good to me, Bran said, and Ursula smiled, imagining that he would be glad of a game that he could join in with. Well, it would, wouldn't it? Seeing as you always win, Arya said irritably, and Bran smirked at her. Rob rolled his eyes as they all started bickering, shifting himself closer to Ursula and wrapping his arm about her shoulder so she could nestle into the crook of his shoulder. Feeling better, he murmured, so that only she could hear him, and she nodded. Good, he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Tommen would have enjoyed today, Ursula said slightly regretfully, and Rob sighed. When spring comes you will see him again, he said after a long moment, and she raised her head so she could meet his eyes. What do you mean? She asked him. Well, now that we're wed I imagine there will be a big show of unity at the capital. It is hardly something I am looking forward to, but knowing you will be happy on seeing your brother again will make it all the more bearable, he told her softly, and she couldn't help but lean in and press her lips to his for a moment. Thank you, she whispered against the softness of them when she pulled back. He merely smiled in response, before pressing a tiny kiss to the tip of her nose. Must you two be quite so sickening? Arya asked in a disgusted manner, and Rob turned to narrow his eyes at her as the door to the parlor opened again. Mind your own business, or I might suddenly remember that you are still unmarried, Rob said warningly. It is hard to mind my own business when you are being all, with one another right opposite me. Gods, you are almost as bad as Sansa and Oliver. Arya seemed to shudder at that, and Ursula couldn't help but laugh, seeing Lady Stark shaking her head as she directed a serving girl to place the tray of warm spiced milk on the low table between them. Honestly, I leave you all alone for 10 minutes, Lady Stark said exasperatedly, moving to take a seat between Bran and Rickon. I think we should have a private dinner tonight, Mother, Rob said as though he had not heard her. And what is that in honor of? His mother asked in response. Do I need an excuse? Rob raised a brow. I just thought it would be nice, and afterwards we can indulge in a few games of cards before bed. And a bit of truth or tale, Bran said with a grin, and Ursula saw Rob roll his eyes. What is truth or tale? She asked Bran curiously as Rob extracted his arm from around her to lean forwards and pick up 2 cups of warm milk. Rob tells us something that could likely have been from the war, and we have to guess if it happened, or if he is making up tales, Bran explained to her, and she nodded her head, accepting her milk with thanks. But then you would have to rely on Rob being honest with the answers, she said slyly, glancing towards her husband, who grinned at her. True, we have to rely on him remembering his Stark honor, Bran agreed, and she smiled widely before taking a sip from her milk. This is wonderful, Lady Stark, thank you, she directed towards her good mother. It is no matter, Lady Stark smiled kindly, hot water has been called for as well, so don't tarry too long before you go on up for a bath. Ursula thanked her again at that, before sipping on her milk again, feeling it warm her insides deliciously. Rob shifted closer again as she sipped it down, his lips coming to press against her temple before moving to her ear. Drink up quick, wife, he whispered, his warm breath making her shudder slightly. We don't want our bath getting cold without us. Chapter 18:16, Night Calling. Notes. Hey guys. Thanks so much as always for the kudos, and to those of you who left comments. It is much appreciated, I can't thank you enough. Right, are you ready to find out how Rob slayed the dragon? Happy smiley. Chapter text. Rob. The scent of burning flesh filled his nostrils as he screamed for his men to get back. For the archers to regroup and aim up at the dragons again. One had already fallen to what seemed like 1,000 arrows, its scaled body lay sprawled out on the battlefield, along with thousands of men from both sides. The Targaryen had brought an army of Unsullied with her, and while he and his men, along with the southern forces, were more than a match for them, she had also brought with her 3 dragons. They were not quite as huge as had been feared, but they were big enough to even the fight. Rob choked a little on the vile stench that was hanging in the air, tightening his grip on his sword as the 2 remaining dragons swooped down once more. A volley of arrows shot towards the pair of them, and their screams echoed horribly through the dusk. Notch again. Rob bellowed, cutting down an Unsullied who staggered towards him brandishing a lance. The man had clearly been wounded, and it wasn't entirely an even match, but Rob considered it more of a mercy to end his life. Likely he would have died in agony otherwise. Fire, he screamed at his archers, hearing the call echoed through the various garrisons. Thousands more arrows flew up into the air, and the green dragon seemed to bear the brunt of it, snarling and snapping and hissing as it flew limply towards the ground. Easy. Rob cautioned, as several men looked as though they were about to charge at the thing. He could see men advancing from all sides, and the dragon sent out a stream of flames that he could feel the heat from where he stood over 200 feet away. Screams of agony accompanied the inferno, and a third volley of arrows was sent towards the wounded animal. This time he knew it would be fatal, the dragon's head sagging to the ground and a dozen or so lances being thrown at the beast's neck. The one remaining dragon screamed in what Rob could only describe as fury as its brother lay defeated on the battlefield. "Concentrate all your fire on that one, we need to bring it down." Rob heard the command shouted from somewhere nearby, and he could not disagree with it. There were men still engaging with the Unsullied, keeping the horde back from the garrisons of archers who were aiming for the skies once more. "Your Grace," the warning was too late, the ground shaking and almost throwing him off balance as he whirled around. The final dragon had landed mere feet behind him, its eyes wild and jaws snarling. It was not the sight of the beast that took Rob aback though, it was the sight of the woman sat on its back. Almost as though in slow motion she screamed out something in a language Rob could not understand, and he had less than a second to throw himself to the ground. The flames shot out so close to him that he could feel himself growing unbearably hot in his armor. For a moment he thought of the grandfather he had never known, the knowledge of how he had died making him want to retch. Thankfully the flames ceased, and Rob forced himself to push up from the ground, readjusting his grip on his sword. Men were advancing on all sides of the dragon, archers and swordsmen alike, but Rob was the closest to it, and he could see where to round the sword. The underside of the dragon's jaw. Simple if it weren't so damn foolish. Before he could think he went for it, as 100 or so arrows flew into the opposite side of the beast. The dragon screamed, and lashed out so quickly that Rob didn't have a moment to react. Pain ripped through his left shoulder and his screams mingled with that of the dragon. Snarls reached his ears next and he knew it were Grey Wind. He could hear his men screaming at him to fall back, but the blood was pounding in his ears as he somehow pushed himself up from the ground. The blood was hot and sticky running down his arm, but he still had his sword, and one precise hit could end this without any more of his men being burned alive. Grey Wind moved himself around, snarling and snapping at the dragon's feet, driving the beast wild as it couldn't move quickly enough to snap its jaws around him. Rob staggered forward, gripping his sword more tightly in his hand. He was almost afraid to look when he got closer, but somehow he managed to get himself into position. A second later he thrust his sword upwards with all the strength he had left, feeling the blood from the dragon come pouring down over him. He gasped, his nostrils full of the metallic scent, as the great animal reared up on its hind legs, its wings flapping feebly for a moment before it collapsed down dead with a mighty crash. Rob gasped air into his lungs, feeling hands finding him, mouths uttering questions that he could not quite decipher. The rider he managed, the woman. Where is the woman? The Targaryen. Voices answered him but he could not comprehend them, moving forward with insistent hands supporting him. Vaguely he heard the calls for the Maester, but he shrugged away those who tried to insist on leading him away from the battlefield. He had to know what had become of the woman. Eventually they stopped trying to persuade him to leave, merely supporting him as he sought her out. Around the body of the great, black dragon they went, seeing the ground littered with countless bodies as they moved. Rob looked out for any hint of silvery blonde, finally finding what he was looking for. He increased his pace, those supporting him cautioning him against punishing himself further. He ignored them, moving to the woman's side. She was lying face down on the ground, and Rob somehow managed to find the words to tell them to roll her over. There didn't appear to be a mark on her as they moved to do his bidding. No arrow. No sword wound. Likely the fall had killed her. He nodded to his men, and they turned her over in one swift move. Rob woke with a strangled cry, his chest drenched with sweat as he gasped air into his lungs. Merciless, he turned over in the bed, expecting to see her sleeping peacefully at his side. The other side of the bed was empty though, and he pushed himself up, breathing hard. Merciless, he repeated in a panic. Where was she? He tried to calm his breathing, telling himself it was just a dream. Just a dream. He ran his hand through his damp curls and tried to think straight. He had not dreamt about that day for so long. Not in so much detail, and never with that ending. That wasn't how it ended. It ended with him finding unseeing violet eyes, not green ones. Not merciless. Mercila, he almost choked on his wife's name as he remembered her still and unmoving in his dream. It wasn't Mercila, it was Daenerys. It was the Targaryen. Mercila is safe, nothing can hurt her. If that were true, then where in the name of the gods was she? Why was she not curled up in bed with him? His hands went to scrabble frantically under the blankets, feeling her side of the bed almost cold. In the next moment he was throwing the blankets and furs off himself and snatching up his robe. He went to the washroom first, knocking lightly on the door and calling her name softly. When he got no answer, he pushed open the door to see it empty. Again he ran his hand through his hair, backing away from the washroom and turning to scan their bedchamber. She was not here. If she were, then she would have answered him when he had called her name. Where was she? Gods! Oh gods! He took deep, calming breaths, reminding himself yet again that it had only been a dream. He was making for the door of their chambers before he could think on it anymore, almost running down the hallways, listening and looking out for any sign of his wife. Where would she go? He could not understand where she would go in the middle of the night. Vaguely he wondered if she would go down to the September, and he halted, trying to imagine if that was something she would do. She would often visit the September when he was in council, but she was not a particularly devout woman. He bit down on his lip, slowing his pace as he tried to decide whether or not he should go all the way down there and check. Before he could make up his mind though, he heard her soft tones and whirled around. Rukun's chamber door stood slightly ajar, and he approached it, certain he could hear Mercila's voice coming from within. Everyone gets bad dreams, Rukun, she was soothing his brother, that does not mean you are weak or foolish. Rukun snuffled something in return that Rob could not quite make out, and he heard Mercila hushing and soothing him again in response. There is nothing to be ashamed of, she assured Rukun, and Rob moved himself slightly so he could peer through the gap in the door. She was sat at Rukun's bedside, smoothing her hand through his hair as she hushed him. He could plainly tell that his little brother had been crying, and it made his heart clench uncomfortably. Would you like me to sing to you? Mercila asked, and Rukun nodded his head in response. Very well, she continued, stroking her hand through his hair for a moment before she began to sing softly. It was a lullaby of a sort, a southern one, Rob imagined, as he had never heard it here in the north before. He had never heard anything like her sweet voice in all his life. Many a singer had entertained in the dining hall, but none had ever sounded as heavenly as she did. He backed away from the door, leaning against the wall before he slowly sank down to the floor outside Rukun's chamber. Listening to her beautiful voice calmed his still racing heart, chasing all lingering thoughts of that dream away from him. He leant his head back against the wall and exhaled in satisfaction as he listened to her. He didn't know how long he was sat there, allowing her voice to wash over him, but eventually she came to the end of her song. In the next moment he heard a slight shuffling from inside Rukun's chamber, and he rose back up to his feet as the door opened just wide enough for Mercila to slip out. She gasped on seeing him, her hand coming to her heart as she took in several deep breaths, her eyes wide as she looked up at him. He moved closer, pulling Rukun's door closed quietly before he gathered her up in his arms. What are you doing out here? She asked him weakly, clinging as tightly to him as he was to her. I woke up and you were gone, he said. I didn't know where you were, I had to find you. He pressed fierce kisses to the top of her head as she seemed to clutch him even closer. I wasn't far, she soothed him. I was a little restless, and then I heard Rukun crying out. I couldn't just leave him, Rob, he sounded so upset. You don't have to explain, he soothed her, finally relinquishing the tight hold he had on her. She stepped back slightly and looked up to meet his eyes, a frown creasing her brow slightly as she moved her hand up to cup his cheek. You're pale, she said worriedly, her hand moving from his cheek up to his forehead, her frown only deepening as she did so. And clammy, she continued, do you feel well? I'm fine, he assured her, though she did not look completely at ease with his answer. Rukun is not the only one who gets bad dreams, he elaborated, and a look of understanding crossed her features. What was it? She asked him softly, and he shook his head. Just the war, he said dismissively, nothing I have not dreamt before. I just panicked when I saw you were gone, that's all. She pressed herself back against him at his words, and he held her tightly, breathing in the scent of her and savoring the way she felt under his touch. Warm. Real. Alive. He breathed a sigh of relief against the top of her head before pressing a kiss into her hair. "Come on," he murmured, "let us go back to bed before we freeze." She stepped away at his suggestion, lacing her fingers through his as they made their way back to their chambers. Once inside, he regretfully let go of her hand so she could move round to her side of the bed. He went towards the fire, tossing several logs on top of the dying embers. With luck the fire would live until the morning, and it would be one less thing for the serving girls to worry about. He stared into the slowly rising flames for a long moment before he turned away and made his way back to bed, shedding his robe as he went. Ursula snuggled up against him as soon as he shifted beneath the furs, and he held her close, stroking his hand through her hair. "Ursula," he asked softly, and she hummed in response. "Would you sing to me?" he asked her nervously, and she turned her head to press a kiss above his heart. "Of course I will, if you want me to," she told him, and he pressed a kiss of his own to her forehead. "Please," he confirmed, "I think it might help me dream of something good." They were ambling round the gardens the next afternoon, and Rob could still not tear his mind entirely from his dream. Whenever his concentration lapsed he would see it. He would see Ursula laying there still and unmoving, her eyes glassy as she stared unseeing up at the skies. It didn't matter how many times he told himself that it was the Targaryen, the image of his wife had replaced her and it made him feel sick. "Won't you tell me what's wrong?" Ursula asked him, her hand clenching a little more tightly around his arm as they walked. He sighed in response, not knowing whether or not he should tell her. Whether she would think him foolish or not. "It's not me, is it?" she pressed him, her tone almost fearful. "No, of course not," he soothed her, "it's just that stupid dream playing on my mind, that's all." "What was it?" she asked him tentatively, and he closed his eyes almost despairingly for a moment. "The dragons," he told her. "I suppose it was more memory than dream, until the end at least." His tone was dark towards the end, and Ursula squeezed his arm reassuringly in response. "What happened at the end?" she asked quietly, and he sighed. "When I found Daenerys Targaryen's body she was lying face down on the battlefield," he told her, pausing to take a breath. "Only in the dream, when I asked my men to turn her over, well, when they turned her onto her back I didn't see her eyes, he swallowed hard, I saw yours. I was dead. In her place." Ursula asked him softly, and he nodded his head. "It was just a dream," she said at once. "What would I ever be doing out on a battlefield?" She tried to sound teasing, but her voice was laced with more than a little apprehension. "I shouldn't have told you," Rob said at once, and she shook her head in response. "No," she protested, "no, I am glad you told me. I want us to be able to share everything with one another, in the end." Rob halted his steps then, Ursula stopping beside him and looking up at him curiously. He turned to face her, placing his hands on her shoulders and gazing into her bright, living eyes for a long moment. "I didn't know what losing you would do to me before," he told her quietly, "but I have some idea now, and I can't, Ursula. I can't lose you, not now." Her eyes shone with tears at his words, her gloved hands coming up to caress his as her lower lip trembled slightly. "I was afraid of you caring, deep down," she told him, and he frowned. "Why?" he asked simply, and she smiled wryly. "I will give you 3 guesses." She arched one brow, and he sighed heavily. "Your mother." He spoke the 2 words like a curse, and she nodded her confirmation. "She told me not to show you weakness," Ursula told him, the first time she had truly opened up about her mother. "And to her that means caring?" Rob asked, frowning deeply. Again Ursula nodded, and he felt even more anger towards Cersei Lannister. "I knew she was wrong even before the wedding," Ursula explained. "I knew I cared for you, and I hoped you cared for me, but... Rob urged her when she showed no sign of continuing with her explanation. "But it is hard to ignore words from your own mother," she said, "when you have never been free to do anything for yourself. I had no choice but to look to her. She had been in my position marrying a stranger for advantage. Because that is all this is to my grandfather. Making me queen means he does not lose all hold on the north and the riverlands. But you," she slipped her hand away from his and moved it to his cheek, "you turned out to be nothing like she prepared me for, and I thank the gods for it." "And you don't doubt me?" he asked her, not caring if he sounded needy. He had to know. "No," she shook her head, "I never really did. She just, my mother, she knows just how to needle her way inside your head. For a time I let her, but I won't anymore, Rob. I promise. That was all he needed to hear, and he pulled her into an embrace in response, kissing the top of her head fiercely. You deserved better than life at the capital, he told her lowly, and she pressed herself closer to him for a moment before she pulled her head back so she could look up onto his eyes. I have better, she said firmly. I'm here. He couldn't help but kiss her on hearing those words, savoring her soft lips on his as they worked slowly together. When he could barely suppress his desire for her any longer, he pulled back, meeting her eyes once more. Did you write back to her the other day? He asked her, and she shook her head. I ought to, I know that, especially since I replied to Tommen at once, but I just don't know what to say to her, she said exasperatedly. She is so convinced that you must be awful to me, and that any caring you are showing is merely you playing a game with me so you can hurt me more in the future. Gods, she clenched her fists against his chest in anger, and he stayed silent, sensing that she hadn't finished. She assumes to know all about our marriage, she assumes that I suffer at your hands, she continued, and I swear she wants it to be true. She wants you to be a monster. Why would she want that? What kind of mother wants their child to suffer? I don't know the answer to that, Rob told her honestly. It was the truth. He had no idea, because he was lucky. He had grown up with a mother who adored him and a father who doted on him. Not once had they ever made him feel anything but safe and loved. He could not imagine what it was like to grow up with an absent father and a mother that he could only describe as neglectful at best, and cruel at worst. Ursula smiled slightly wryly, shaking her head before she lay her head against his chest. He smoothed his hands through her hair and hoped that the action was calming to her. Somehow he sensed that she had let out more than she had meant to when talking about her mother, but he was pleased that she had opened up to him. He had been curious for a long time about what exactly she had had to live with at the capital, and he wondered whether he ought to push her any further or just leave it be. She was happy here. He had heard that from her own mouth. Did he really want to drag up all her horrible memories to satisfy his own morbid curiosity? Was she always like that? He asked before he could stop himself, and she sighed heavily. When Joffrey was still alive she wasn't as bitter, Ursula told him. He was her golden prince and she doted on him. Tommen and I were just afterthoughts. She left us to our nurses for the most part. Sometimes she would be smiling and happy, and we would cling to that. It made us feel like she loved us as much as she loved Joff. And then he died, Rob prompted her, and she nodded her head against his chest. She was wild with grief, she elaborated. Half the time she was drunk, and the rest of the time she was arguing with grandfather. He was so afraid of what she might do that he sent Sansa into my uncle Tyrion's protection when he went out to treat with you. After the pact was made it was like I ceased to exist to her. She poured everything into Tommen. Well, she did when she wasn't drunk. I thank the gods he did not let her fawning and indulgence spoil him the way it spoiled Joffrey. Grandfather attempted to send her back to the Rock after the war beyond the wall, but she refused to leave. I don't think she will ever leave Tommen, not after Joff. As I said, you deserved better, Rob murmured against the top of her head, pressing more kisses to her hair. Don't go pitying me, Ursula pulled back, a slight smile on her face. I knew no better, she almost laughed. It wasn't until I came here and saw the way your family is that I realized that mine wasn't normal. He couldn't help but laugh himself at that, tucking a lock of her hair back behind her ear. If you think my family is normal then the gods help you, he said, to which her giggles only intensified. He was glad to hear her laugh, to see the carefree expression on her face as her eyes lit up. It sounded as though she had never been allowed to be a child the way he and his siblings had, and so he quietly determined that she could be as free as he could allow her to be, now that she was under his protection. Come on, he regretfully pulled away from their embrace and wrapped his arm about her shoulder. Let's get you back to the keep. I distinctly remember you promising to help Rickon with his sums this afternoon. Ursula merely groaned at that, slipping her arm around his waist as they trudged their way through the snow towards the garden gate. Through it they went, reaching the bottom of the keep steps before Rob was hailed from the other side of the courtyard by Sir Roderick. You go on ahead, he urged Ursula. I will join you in the library in a moment. She agreed readily, and he pressed his lips to hers for a moment, before turning his attention to Sir Roderick as she climbed the steps. Rob made his way to meet him in the middle of the courtyard, suppressing a groan as he saw the grim look on his face. What is it? He asked in a resigned manner. Word from the wall, Your Grace, Sir Roderick told him. Seems there has been a deserter. Rob sighed heavily at that, knowing it would mean him riding out. He kept to the rules his father had always taught him, though at times like this he wished he had someone else to deal his justice for him. "Where?" Rob asked him, running his hand through his hair. "Picked up by some of Lord Umber's men near the Long Lake. They are keeping him there at the village at the northern end. They have informed the watch as well. I believe the Lord Commander will come down to meet you," Sir Roderick told him, and Rob smiled slightly. At least there was some good news. He may have to reluctantly leave his wife and home again, but at least he would get to see his brother again before winter came. Chapter 19:17, Lady of Winterfell. Notes. Hey guys, new chapter for you all, hope you enjoy. Thank you so much to those who left comments, and to you lovelies who left enough kudos to get me to 500, thank you so much. Happy smiley. Chapter text. Myrcella. He was leaving again. He was mere minutes away from walking out of the door and leaving again. For longer this time, no doubt. He was insistent on no one coming out and waving him off, instead he was saying his farewells inside the keep. Most had been made now, he had embraced Bran and Rickon and shared a few japes with them. He had ruffled Arya's hair and insisted she behave herself in his absence and not spend all her time in the tiltyard. Then he had embraced her too and moved to his mother. They were speaking in hushed tones near the door, and try as she might Myrcella could not make out what they were talking about. She swallowed hard, her stomach clenched unpleasantly as Rob finally stopped speaking to his mother and embraced her tightly for a moment. There was only her left now, and she was dreading this goodbye. The first time had been bad enough, but at least it had been away from prying eyes. She took a deep breath as he turned to look at her, seeing regret shining in the impossible blue of his eyes. It would do no good to let her inner misery show on her face. No doubt that would only make him feel even guiltier for leaving her again. She had lost count of the number of times he had apologized to her the day and night before. It seemed as though he had whispered it against every inch of her skin as they had enjoyed one another one last time before dawn broke. Myrcella wrapped her arms around his waist as he came before her, his own clutching her close to his chest as she breathed him in. If she had her way she would never let go. If she had her way someone else would be riding out to Long Lake and dealing with the deserter from the wall. It would have been pointless to argue against his leaving though. He would go, just as he had gone to Torrens Square, and she did not want them to part having exchanged ill words. Instead she had told him she would miss him, but that she understood that he had a duty to perform. He had seemed relieved at her words. That alone was enough to keep her biting her tongue. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head and she closed her eyes tight, imprinting the feel of him on her mind. The memory would have to be enough to sustain her in his absence. She was already imagining the empty space beside her, the cold sheets in the place of his solid, warm body. Gods! She missed him already despite him still being here. When he pulled back slightly she had to resist the urge to press herself flush against him again. Instead she raised her head, meeting his eyes and forcing a smile to her face. "I'll be back as soon as I can," he murmured to her, and she nodded. "I will count the days," she told him honestly, and a smile twitched the corners of his mouth. "I am sure you will find plenty to do in my absence, just promise me you'll stay safe and warm," he implored her, and again she nodded. "I will gladly promise you, if you will promise me the same," she said, and it was his turn to nod, before he leant in and pressed a firm kiss to her forehead. "I promise," he murmured against her skin, his lips fluttering warmly against her. It was almost enough to make her shudder, her fingers clenching slightly around his forearms. "I'd best not keep the men waiting any longer," he said more loudly, as though to all present. Myrcella forced herself to let go of his arms, seeing that look of regret in his eyes again as his own hands came from her waist. "The sooner you leave, the sooner you will return," Lady Stark said briskly, and Myrcella nodded, trying to brighten her expression. Rob clearly wasn't fooled, she could tell by the look in his eyes, but she was grateful that he said nothing to call attention to it. Instead he cupped her face in his hands gently before pressing a firm but chaste kiss to her lips. There were unspoken words in his eyes when he pulled back, and she felt her own sticking in her throat. "I'll be back soon," he finally said, after which he turned abruptly and marched from the parlor. The silence he left behind was thick, and Myrcella could feel 4 sets of eyes on her as she stood there. If she looked she knew she would see sympathy, and that was the last thing she wanted to be faced with. Instead she took a deep breath before she too marched from the parlor. She didn't stop until she reached the entrance hall, and she could hear the sound of hooves on stones even through the closed doors. Without another thought she went for them, the guards springing into action at once, opening them up before bowing her through them. She had forgotten her cloak, but it hardly mattered, she wouldn't be out for long. As she descended the steps she saw the last of the mounted men disappearing under the northern gate of the keep. She walked briskly towards the gatehouse, shivering slightly in the cold air, but grateful at least that it wasn't snowing. Quickly, she made for the steps that would take her up onto the ramparts. The wind was more raw up here, and she shuddered as she looked north, seeing the small band of men riding quickly down the road that would lead them towards Long Lake. At the head of the party she could make him out easily, his auburn head easily distinguished from his dark companions. He didn't look back as she stood up there watching him, but it eased her somewhat as she kept her eyes on him until he became little more than a speck in the vast bleakness of the north. Ursula allowed herself to wallow for a few days, missing Rob more than she had ever imagined she would. It was worse this time, on account of the fact that they had had such a blissful time together since he had returned from Torrance Square. She even missed the sound of his breathing. That was when she knew she had to snap out of it. Rob wouldn't want her to be miserable in his absence. What she needed was something to distract her from missing him. So, with that in mind, on the third day she hauled herself out of bed and dressed warmly, braiding her hair back from her face and pulling on her sturdiest boots. When she was ready she made her way from their chambers and down the hallway to the stairs. Down she went, entering the dining hall first so she could break her fast. There was no one around but the servants, and Ursula did her best to ignore the hardness in their eyes when they were curtsying to her. The women were the worst, she had discovered that quickly. Not one of them had been what she would call kind, and it made her heart ache for Etta. She had written to her old attendant, but had yet to hear a reply. Gods, she hoped that she was all right. Ursula imagined that she might have left the capital and returned home to the Stormlands by now. Perhaps her family would have found a match for her. Ursula hoped that she would be happy, thinking that she might mention her to Tommen in her next letter and hope that her brother knew something of her. Of course, it could just be that her returning letter had been lost. That happened a lot during winter, and it was well upon them now. At least, it was here in the north. She had grown quickly used to the cold, and had not let the snow stop her from taking her daily walks with Rob. A cold sun still shone for a few hours each day. It was just enough to cheer her, just the sight of it. The keep was where she clung to when the darkness came though, the soft warmth of the candles, and the flickering heat of the countless fires. Ursula pointedly thanked the servants who brought her breakfast, but not one of them would look her in the eye as they served her. She tried not to let it get to her, but it was difficult to when she saw how they fawned over the other members of the Stark family. Some of the guards had grown to speak kindly to her, and she had been pleased to share smiles with them as she went about her daily business. The serving girls though were apparently less forgiving. Ursula often saw them whispering behind their hands. She did not know what they uttered to one another, but it was not hard to guess. They assumed her an impostor. A bastard. A girl with no right to sit the throne next to their beloved king. She sighed heavily and finished the rest of her breakfast before picking up her wine cup and draining it. With that she pushed away from the table and made her way down the middle of the hall, purposely raising her chin just a little higher than necessary. It didn't matter what they thought. Rob and the Starks mattered, and they wanted her here. That was enough for her. She approached the guards in the entrance hall, smiling brightly for them, pleased when they returned the gesture easily. "Are you wishing to leave the keep, my queen?" one of them asked her. "That depends," she responded. "I am looking for Lady Stark. Do either of you gentlemen know where she might be?" "I believe she was heading to the steward, my queen," came her reply, and she nodded her thanks. "Thank you," she voiced it. "I will trouble you no longer." They both bowed to her as she turned on her heel and made her way down the hallways towards the steward's quarters. She was glad that Lady Stark was with him and not with the maester, so she didn't have to head out into the cold to reach his tower. Ursula paused when she came to the door, hoping her intrusion would be welcome, before she raised her fist and knocked lightly. "Come," it was the steward, Byrne, who called for her to enter, and she did as she was bid. "My queen," he bowed lowly to her at once, and she hoped that she wouldn't blush. More than anything she wanted him to take her seriously and not see her as a little girl playing at queen. "This is a surprise," Lady Stark said kindly. "What is it we can do for you?" "I wondered if I could help," Ursula said, meeting her good mother's eyes and seeing the surprise in them. It was to be expected, she supposed. So far, despite Robb being insistent that she was now Lady of Winterfell, she had been happy to leave all the duties to his mother. Lady Stark had been in the role for years, and it terrified Ursula to even think of taking over from her. As far as Robb knew, she helped his mother while he was otherwise engaged, and Ursula hadn't had the heart to correct him. Now he was gone, she was determined to learn properly how to run the household and the keep. Her own mother had never taught her, and deemed it beneath her. This wasn't the capital though, everyone here at Winterfell had a duty. Queen or not, Ursula was determined to pull her weight and show everyone that she could fit properly here. Of course Lady Stark's response pulled her from her inner thoughts, and she smiled in relief at once. "I think it past time I learned how to take care of things," Ursula said, and her good mother smiled at her, her eyes so like Robb's sparkling with something that looked almost like pride. "I will be happy to guide you," she assured her, "but don't think you must do everything exactly as I have been doing. We all have our own ways, and as long as they work, it matters not that they differ." Ursula took a breath of relief at that, before taking the few steps to stand at her good mother's side. "These are our usual trading routes," Lady Stark pointed to the papers strewn across the table. "May I?" Ursula asked, looking between her and the steward. Byrne gestured to them easily, smiling slightly at her. "Please, go ahead, my queen," he said, and she pulled a few of the sheets closer to her. She recognized the names of most of the places, though there were a few she didn't. In her mind she made sure to memorize them so she could look them up on the big map of the north in Robb's council chambers later. She noted that Winterfell even shared trade with some of the towns in the Riverlands, recognizing them as those closest to the border. There was a shipment from Dragonstone that appeared to come but once every 6 moons, and she realized after a moment of thought that it was likely dragon glass. Vaguely she remembered hearing her grandfather speak of the walkers, how they could not assume that they would be gone forever. "If they rise again we will be prepared, I will not lose such numbers again." That was why the wall had so many new recruits, and why a stock of dragonglass weapons was being forged and stored. Ursula already knew that those men of the Watch who went out ranging were already required to arm themselves with such weapons. Better safe than sorry after all. She laid the sheet she had been studying back down on the table, taking a breath before she made any comment. "I imagine Winterfell will not be able to rely on trade for much longer," she spoke up, and Byrne nodded his head. "Many of the more remote settlements have already ceased delivery," he informed her. "For now the King's Road is still passable, but it will not be for long. When the snows lay thick all northern settlements will be responsible for their own survival, and that includes Winterfell." It was her turn to nod at that, taking a long breath as she imagined all the little villages and their occupants who would somehow have to manage through the winter. Again, she silently prayed that it would be a short one. She also knew that many of those in tiny, remote settlements came to Wintertown when the weather grew colder. Robb had pointed out to her how many plumes of smoke were rising from the town surrounding them one evening when they were walking along the battlements. He had told her that it was a good sign, that it meant many people had already managed the journey, boarding up their summer homes before coming to their capital for the winter. "Robb told me there is a bountiful harvest in the glass gardens," Ursula spoke up, hoping that her husband had indeed been telling the truth. Thankfully both Byrne and Lady Stark nodded their agreement, and she felt a little placated. "And the grain store is just over half full," Byrne elaborated, "which is good, considering how short the summer proved to be. Farmers have brought their animals in from the hills, and we already have meat preserved." Again Ursula nodded, trying not to let her distaste show on her face as she remembered the tough strips of salted beef and pork that they had had at the capital during the last winter. "We are well prepared for winter," Ursula. Lady Stark smiled kindly. "We are Starks, after all." Ursula's head was spinning by the time she went up to her chambers for bed. She had had no idea the amount of work that Lady Stark put into running Winterfell. Naively, she had assumed that most of the work was done by others, and that her good mother merely oversaw it, or ordered it to be done. Not so. Lady Stark seemed to have no help besides that of the steward and the maester, though she had been without complaint as Ursula had trailed her around, trying to take in as much as she could. There were so many problems that she had to consider, and so many people to speak and consult with. There were things she had to order for the keep that Ursula had never even considered, such as candles and firewood. They had spoken to the woodman, and they had told them of the difficulty of keeping up their work rate given the worsening weather and the short hours of daylight. Lady Stark had listened sympathetically, and in the end she had promised them the coin needed to recruit 2 more men. Ursula had asked her where she would find the coin from, and her good mother had told her that there would be no need for fine silks and laces to be bought for the seamstress during such a time. They had then been confronted by stonemasons who were grumbling about their lack of work. Again, Lady Stark had placated them, telling them they could work on fixing the crumbling walls in the gardens. It wasn't much, but it was something to keep them occupied until Rob returned and could order something more substantial for them to be getting on with. Ursula knew that he intended to add to the stables and the grain stores, but both she and Lady Stark were unwilling to sanction such a large amount of coin without his explicit instruction. Tom, the baker, had asked that he be allowed slightly more grain each day so he could bake more loaves. Now that the population of Wintertown was increasing, he was sold out of bread long before midday and having to turn disappointed customers away. That was something Ursula had felt confident enough in granting. Even with her limited knowledge, it made sense to allow Tom more grain each day. The more he sold, the more coin he made, which meant that more coin would come back to Rob through taxes. Added to that was the knowledge that the people would be better fed. Ursula also knew that 3 wagons of grain were on their way from the Riverlands, and would likely reach Winterfell within the next days. After giving Tom permission to increase his order of grain, she had looked to Lady Stark to make sure she had done the right thing. Thankfully her good mother had smiled, and told her that the man Tom employed to grind the grain into flour would likely be grateful for the extra coin and the extra hours as well. She had been relieved at Lady Stark's praise, and glad that she had managed to at least contribute to her duties. Selfishly, she had also hoped that Tom might speak of her act of kindness to others, and that they might begin to thaw a little towards her. She had not come across many of the townsfolk, but she could not help but imagine that they probably harbored similar feelings to those of the servants at the keep. Hopefully Tom would have a kind word to say about her, and hopefully, others would listen to him. She didn't want Rob's subjects to despise her. Likely they would never love her or clamor for her, but she did not relish the thought of being forever looked upon disdainfully and whispered about behind raised hands. She did not want to end up being her mother. Ursula shuddered slightly as she undressed, wrapping Rob's robe firmly around her and deciding not to think any more about her mother. She had eventually written back to her, again insisting that Rob treated her well and that the Starks were being most kind to her. There was no reply as yet, but she tensed herself for one every day whenever she saw the maester approaching with letters in his hands. She lived with half a hope that this time she would get through to her mother. Likely it would prove futile, but at least she could say she had tried. With a sigh she pulled back the covers and furs and climbed into bed, snuggling down against the pillows and tucking the furs around her. Once settled, she tucked the lapels of Rob's robe closer to her face and inhaled the scent of him that still lingered there. She had worried that he might take it away with him when he left, but he had laughed and told her that when under canvas in snow it was best to sleep fully clothed. Gods! She hoped he was warm enough, that enough furs had been packed onto the horses, and that they were managing to light a fire come nightfall. He had told her that he would be just fine, assured her that he was a Stark. That winter flowed through his veins. Grey Wind was with him too, and Ursula had no doubt that his wolf would curl up at his side and keep him warm should it be necessary. She closed her eyes, feeling irrationally jealous of the great beast. What she wouldn't give to be the one curling up beside him every night, warming him despite the freezing temperatures surrounding them. She sighed. Soon enough he would be back, and she had no doubt that he wouldn't be able to leave again before the snows melted. If news of a deserter had come just a little later, then she knew that it would just have had to wait until spring. The snows were falling so thickly when they came now, and the air was so cold that it all just settled, freezing hard and just waiting for another flurry to add more height to it. Already, Ursula was living with the fear that Rob might not be able to make it home. She had voiced it at dinner, trying to sound casual as she asked how deep the snow would have to fall to prevent him from returning. Bran had soothed her fears somewhat, telling her that the snow froze so hard that people would only sink down a few inches in the softer, newly fallen snow, before hitting the rock-hard snow beneath. It could be several feet deep, but as long as it was frozen solid it didn't matter. Horses would find it difficult, especially with the weight of a man atop them, but it came to it then the men would just dismount and walk, leading their mounts behind them. Ursula hoped it wouldn't come to that. Right now the snow was only a few feet deep, easily passable for the horses, and thankfully there had only been a few flurries of snow since Rob had departed. He was going further north though, further into the winter. She could only hope that the snows would not fall too hard where he was going. She needed to know he would get home, already being without him was like torture. The sooner he returned to her, the better she would sleep at night. Chapter 20, 18, Reminisce. Notes. Hello, everyone. New chapter for you that I hope you will enjoy. Big thanks to everyone who has left kudos. Extra big thanks to 3 users who left such lovely comments and filled me with such positivity. Cindy Caramel, MS_Moon21, and Blue Moon Blues, thank you all so much. And thank you to everyone else who has commented along the way. I still can't believe how much people are enjoying this, so thanks. Anyway, hope you enjoy the new one. Happy Smiley. Chapter text. Rob. Rob had been more glad that he could explain to see the small settlement rising up out of the mist after journeying for near a week. Only a few of the little fishing huts had plumes of smoke rising up from the roofs, and he imagined most of the inhabitants had already made the journey to Last Hearth for the winter. Usually it was the old who remained behind, unable or unwilling to make the journey through the snow. Rob knew well enough that not all of them would survive winter, but he tried not to dwell upon it as they came upon the stables and large storage barn. Several horses were already tethered, so he knew well enough that the men of the night's watch would already have arrived. His eyes went to the barn as he dismounted, handing the reins to Billy with thanks. He noted the lock on the barn doors, and the 2 men stood guard outside, and knew at once that the deserter must be being kept inside. Further on he could see the shapes of several tents and the flickers of bonfires. On seeing them he gave the order to his small band of men to set up camp amongst the men of the watch. They agreed readily, already unpacking canvas and furs from the horses. Rob walked away from them then, making his way to the guards at the barn, seeing the sigil of House Umber stitched into their cloaks. "How is Lord Umber faring?" Rob asked as he approached, remembering the Great Jon being unable to attend his wedding due to illness. The small Jon had returned to Last Hearth after their trip to Torrens Square, and he had heard nothing since. "My lord is faring better," one of the men informed him, "though he has been taking less duties. He asked us to relay his well wishes to you, your grace, and to the queen." "That is most kind of him," Rob said, inclining his head. "You must relay my own well wishes, and hopes that he soon makes a full recovery." The man bowed his head at that, and promised to pass on Rob's message. "Does our deserter speak?" Rob asked next, inclining his head towards the barn door. "Only to say he is cold, that he only wanted to go home," the man informed him, and Rob sighed heavily. "How old?" Rob asked next, steeling himself for the answer. "A man grown, your grace. He has seen over 30 name days, I would wager," the man informed him, and he took a breath of relief. It was always worse when the deserters were young and would quake with fear, begging for forgiveness. Rob hated having to pass the sentence of death to them, but they had broken vows, and he had to uphold the laws of the country that had existed for far longer than he had. His father had had to endure it, and now he did too. It was the way of the world, the duty he had been born to do. "Have him ready at first light," Rob said, again inclining his head. The man returned his gesture. "As you wish, your grace." With that Rob turned heel and walked away, skirting round the shores of the lake to try and gather his thoughts before turning and heading up towards the camp. This was only the 4th time he had had to ride out to deal with a deserter, but each time it stabbed as a reminder of the last time he had ridden out with his father. When they had found the direwolves, not long before King Robert had come down from the capital and unwittingly asked his father to come to his death. Rob clenched his fists hard. It still hurt to think of it. Still angered him. Even after all these years he could still not make peace with the injustice of it all. Grey Wind's happy whines and yelps drew his attention as he walked closer to the camp, hearing the yaps of another wolf joining in with his elation. He followed the sounds, knowing they would lead him to his brother. Sure enough, he passed between 2 tents to see Grey Wind and Ghost rolling around happily and snapping playfully at one another, and an amused-looking Jon stood in the mouth of his own tent watching them. Would you be offended if I declined us rolling in the snow? Rob spoke up to draw his attention, and John grinned widely on seeing him. Wondered when you would show up, his brother said, and Rob stamped towards him. Lord Commander, he stopped a few feet from him and inclined his head. Your Grace. John inclined his own head, before they both laughed heartily and stepped forward to meet in a brotherly embrace. You look half wild, brother. Rob stepped back, ruffling his hand in John's unruly hair, taking in the length of it and the length of his beard. And you look well groomed, brother, John returned, as a king ought to, I would wager. Rob only laughed at that, rolling his eyes and clapping John on the shoulder. Come, they have just brought meat and mead, John said, clapping his hand between his shoulder blades and guiding him into his tent. There was a brazier flickering in the middle, and Rob moved to it, removing his gloves and warming his hands by the flames for a moment as John poured them both a tankard. Have you seen him? John asked as he offered one of the tankards to him. No, Rob replied, taking it from him. I spoke with the guards, told them to have him ready by morning. Did you know him? Of course I knew him, John said, seating himself down at the table. Rob moved to take the seat opposite him, taking in his brother's stance, and seeing him relaxed. From that he could only conclude that the deserter had not been someone he had been friendly with, something that helped to quell his lingering unease. Have him pegged for a deserter? Rob asked, taking a long drink of the mead and finding it rich and fulfilling. This is a good barrel, he commented before John could answer his question. His brother agreed, brought down from last hearth as a gesture of goodwill to you, your Grace. John grinned at the end and Rob narrowed his eyes slightly at him. And how much have you and your men helped yourselves to? He asked, and John chuckled. There's plenty left, never fear, John said mockingly. Good, Rob said pointedly, taking another long draught from his tankard. To answer your question, perhaps, John said after a moment, he never settled nor formed a close bond with any of the others. To say he was reluctant to say his vows would be an understatement, but he did swear them. No one forced him. We all have a chance to say no, Rob, but he didn't. He swore his life to the watch, and now he has to pay for his desertion. Rob nodded slowly at that. Hearing John's words definitely made him feel a whole lot better about the duty he would have to perform come morning. Anyway, John spoke up again as he moved to help himself to the meat and bread that had been brought for them. Enough of this unpleasantness for now. How is everything? Everyone. It has been far too long since I have seen any of you. Everyone is fine. The threat of winter is weighing on all our minds, but our stores are healthy enough, and it cannot be any worse than the last one, Rob said, grimacing slightly at the memory of the seemingly never-ending, bitterly cold weather and near-constant darkness. Last one tested us all, John agreed grimly. I don't think we would be alone in praying for a winter as short as the summer we briefly enjoyed. Rob hummed his agreement at that, pulling some of the food onto his own plate. How is the Queen? John asked almost tentatively, his eyes fixed on his plate rather than on Rob. Perfectly well, Rob answered him, or at least she was when I left Winterfell. I can only hope she is still as I left her. Good, John sounded relieved, raising his head back up from his plate and moving to top up their tankards. Again Rob hummed his agreement, his mouth full of boar that was far more tender than he had imagined it would be. Bran? John asked next, licking his fingers clean of grease. Growing more learned by the day, Rob informed him, and his brother nodded slowly. Rooken? He asked as Rob took another mouthful. Finally getting on better with his sums, Rob told him once he had swallowed down his mouthful, and John chuckled. Arya? He inquired next, and Rob rolled his eyes. A pain in my neck, he said exasperatedly, but I would not change her for anything, and she seems to have struck up some kind of affinity with Myrcella now, which makes life slightly easier. I don't suppose you have seen much of Sansa? John raised a brow before bringing his flagon back up to his lips. She came for the wedding, Rob said, with Oliver and the girls. We will not see them now until winter is over, but they were all well in the time we had with them. And your mother? John asked slightly stiffly, and Rob smiled slightly. As well as she can be, he said honestly, though she is still in widow's black. John nodded sympathetically at that as Rob took a rather large mouthful of mead. I still miss him too, John said quietly after a long moment of silence, and Rob nodded heavily. We all do, he said just as quietly, and they both lapsed into silence for another long moment. Do you ever wonder what he would think of us now? John finally spoke up again, and Rob's brow furrowed as he thought on it. "I hope he'd be proud," he said honestly after a moment's reflection. No doubt." John nodded his head, "King in the North, and of the Trident, peace with the Lannisters and the family safe." "I'm not sure he'd be happy with all of that," Rob said honestly, sighing heavily before taking a long drink. "You did what you had to do, it doesn't mean you've forgiven them," John said quietly, his eyes insistent when Rob met them. "I just wish I could have ended the Kingslayer and his bitch of a sister," Rob said irritably, "that would have been real justice. They spawned our father's killer, they created the monster who took him from us." His hands were shaking by the end, and he clenched them both round his tankard to quell the shake. "You couldn't have refused," John said quietly, "you would have been mad to refuse. Think of the lives you saved by signing that treaty. You did the right thing. I would have done exactly the same in your position." "But would Father?" Rob asked him just as quietly, and he saw John sigh heavily. It was something that still plagued Rob, even after all these years. He knew well enough that his father had given up his own life to ensure the secret of the royal children was uncovered. He had exposed them so that Stannis would know he was the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. His father would have backed Stannis had he been able, Rob knew that well enough, and yet he had still helped to ensure that the rightful heir to the throne would never seat it. To help justify it, he told himself that Stannis would have plunged the kingdoms into turmoil with his worship of the Red God. He told himself that by helping stamp out his threat he was saving the kingdoms from years of potential civil war. The people would not have taken kindly to their gods being burned before their eyes, nor their septons. Nor those who just rejected the new religious ideology Stannis had been intent on installing. That eased his conscience where Stannis had been concerned, and he told himself that his father would have understood. His father could never have followed a man who would desecrate the gods he worshipped, rightful heir to the throne or not. He would have followed Renly in his place though, no doubt. Renly had been a friend to his father, and that was the reason Rob had refused point blank to engage him or his army. He had agreed to take his army and meet Stannis, but he had left Renly to Tywin. Renly was dead before the Lannister army had even come upon the camp, slain in the night, and the Tyrells had meekly surrendered there and then. They had taken his head anyway, and adorned it atop the walls of the Red Keep. Rob was glad he had not been there to see that sight. Had been glad to march back to the north and leave the blood and the guilt behind him. For the girls, John's voice snapped him out of his troubled memories, he would have done anything to get the girls back. Rob nodded his head, determined to believe his brother, and determined to drown out his memories. "If I had done things differently, I would not have Myrcella. She had made signing that treaty even harder." The thought of having her as his wife had filled him with dread. Had almost disgusted him. Now she was the one thing that could keep any lingering guilt away better than anything else ever could. Knowing he had her somehow made all the rest of it blur into insignificance. It made it all worth it. She was a prize, not a burden, and by the gods he was missing her so much in this moment that he could barely stand it. "Are you all right?" John asked him concernedly, and he nodded automatically. "I will be," he responded, "as soon as this is over with and I can be on my way home again." The sky dawned a glorious red, a sure sign of blood being spilled this day, at least according to the old tales. Rob wasn't sure that was a tale he had much faith in, given the amount of blood he had known to be shed on days that had dawned grey or white or yellow. Still, the sky was not wrong on this occasion. The deserter's blood would stain the snow within the hour, Rob himself would make certain of that. He stretched his back slightly as he breathed in the morning air, his breath rising in clouds before him. Gods, he was sick and tired of sleeping on the hard snow-covered ground, with only a canvas sheet between him and the snow, and furs all around him. He longed to be wrapped in furs and his wife, be warm and snug and bare instead of shivering himself into an uneasy and uncomfortable sleep every night. Sometimes it was easier to sit up and awake, and doze in the saddle during the day's ride. At least that way he could be beside a fire. "Your Grace." Rob turned at the voice, bringing a smile to his face for Billy who was stood with a plate of food for him. "Thank you," he said, taking the plate of bread, cheese, and cold meat from the night before, and moving to sit atop an upturned barrel that had been set near the dying embers of one of last night's bonfires. Morning John's sleepy voice drew his attention as he ate, and he looked up to see his brother settling opposite him with a plate of his own. Morning Rob returned when he had swallowed his mouthful. I expect you will be away as soon as this is done with. John guessed well, and Rob nodded his head. He confirmed, it does no good to linger in such times, and I have men who want to be at home. No doubt you yourself want to be home, John said knowingly, and Rob nodded his head again. I cannot deny that, he said, smiling wryly. It is all I have ever wanted since I marched south all those years ago. Yet it seems there is always something to drag me away again. The perils of being king, John said, and he snorted. Rob agreed heavily, one of many. Anyway, don't listen to me, you have burdens of your own. Do you have any outranging at the moment? He determined to change the subject. Talking about home just made him miss it all the more. We have a few out, but with luck they will have returned by the time we do, John answered him. Likely we will not stray far from the wall now. Winter is really setting in, but if you were wondering about the walkers, we have seen nothing. Rob nodded at that, his discomfort eased somewhat. It was foolish, but whenever he received a letter bearing the Lord Commander's seal he always braced himself for news that the dead were walking once more. Good, he said simply, and John nodded his agreement. If I can live out my days without seeing another of those nightmares I will die a happy man, John said, and Rob could only agree with him. He said, I never know what was worse, them or the dragons. John chuckled slightly at that, draining his tankard before setting it down in the snow. At least there were only 3 of them. John winked at him, and Rob rolled his eyes. He said wryly, when you put it like that. He tailed off with a grin, and John smiled widely back. Billy approached them then, and Rob looked to him expectantly. Apologies, Your Grace, he bowed shortly. The men are ready with the deserter. Shall I bring your sword? Fetch it, Rob said heavily, rising up to his feet, John doing the same opposite him. It still felt strange to hear Billy refer to ice as his sword. To him it was still his father's, the one he had hanging from his hip was his. Still, when it came to dealing out the justice of the North he always used the Valyrian steel. When it was not in use it was hung up above the mantel in his council chambers, a permanent reminder of all the times he had ridden out with his father to witness justice carried out. Despite the bloody end to them, Rob had always enjoyed those trips, the times spent laughing with his father, John, and Theon. The times when they would race one another on the way back. He closed his eyes for a moment, pushing those memories to the back of his mind before he opened them again. Ready? John asked him, and he nodded curtly. They walked in step towards the storage barn, seeing Rob's own men, and some members of the Night's Watch already present. They all inclined their heads to them as Rob and John made their appearance. There was a silence about them that Rob was unwilling to break, turning his head to see Billy approaching with ice in its wolf sheath. A rustle from the dying undergrowth drew his attention, and he looked to see Grey Wind and Ghost emerging. Obviously they had just returned from a night's hunting, their muzzles still an ominous red. Grey Wind looked towards him and yapped once, to which Rob inclined his head. With that his wolf and John's padded away from where they were gathered and down towards the shore of the lake. When Billy reached his side he looked towards the 2 Umber guards and inclined his head to them. They moved to enter the barn at once, and Rob counted the beats of his heart as he waited for them to bring out the deserter. They did not take long, holding the man still in the black of the watch between them. The man looked resigned to his fate when he briefly met Rob's eyes, not shrinking back from the block that had been laid out ready for him. Any final words? Rob asked him, taking a few steps closer to the condemned man. Winter would have killed me anyway, the deserter said tiredly. I took a chance, now I must pay the price. He glanced towards where Rob knew Billy was stood with ice as he said the words, and Rob nodded grimly. Kneel, he said quietly, keep yourself still and it will be over in an instant, I can promise you that. The man nodded at that, looking almost grateful to him for his words. Rob half turned towards Billy, gesturing for the sword. His squire came forward, and offered the sheath to him. Rob wrapped his hand around the hilt and pulled it free from the wolf sheath before turning back to the deserter. The 2 guards stood close behind him as he knelt down in the snow and lay his head down on the block. Rob moved to stand beside him, wrapping both his hands around the hilt of the sword before bowing his head. I, Rob Stark, Lord of Winterfell and King in the North, and of the Trident, sentence you to die. May the gods have mercy on your soul. He spoke the words clearly into the silent morning before he lifted ice into position and swung it easily through the air. He was true to his word, the man kept still and the blow was enough to cleanly sever his head from his shoulders. Rob took a breath, closing his eyes for a moment as the metallic tang of blood stung his nostrils. When he opened his eyes again he moved away, those present bowing their heads to him as he passed by them. As he passed John he clapped his brother on the back, before continuing on down towards the shore of the lake. He pulled off his gloves as he approached the water, leaving them atop one of the larger rocks as he knelt down in the shale and lay ice in the freezing waters of Long Lake. A crunching of steps had his head turning, and he smiled faintly as Grey Wind prowled towards him, his muzzle now clean but still damp from the water. He nudged Rob's shoulder with his great head, and he moved one of his hands to scratch behind his ears for a moment, before he turned his attention back to ice. His father had always cleaned it in the pool of the godswood whenever they returned from dealing out justice, but Rob preferred to wash it clean of blood as soon as he could after an execution. He pulled on the hilt, tugging the great blade from the water and seeing it mostly rid of the blood. Using the hem of his cloak he wiped away the few remaining traces, before drying his hands on his cloak and moving to pull his gloves back on. With that he picked up ice and trudged his way back up towards the dismantling camp, Grey Wind padding along quietly at his side. He was glad to see that his own men were moving the packed-up canvases and furs to the tethered horses, pleased that they would soon be on their way again. There was a tinge of disappointment that he would not have more time with John, but he had long grown used to the separation they had to endure. As he thought of him his brother appeared, ghost on his own heels and a faint smile on his lips. "I suppose this is goodbye until spring," John said knowingly, and Rob nodded his agreement. "Aye," he said, "let us all pray that the snows will melt swiftly." "Aye," John agreed, and they eyed one another for a moment before stepping forward and embracing tightly. "Take care of everyone," John murmured, and Rob gripped him even harder for a moment. "I will," he said before they broke apart, "and you make sure that wall stays standing. I have enough to deal with without you bringing that trouble to my door." John laughed at that, clapping him hard on the shoulder. "Right when you get back," John implored him. "Aye, you do the same," Rob responded, and his brother nodded his agreement. "Goodbye, for now," Rob nodded slowly, and John nodded again. "Goodbye, Rob," he said, and Rob inclined his own head before turning away and making his way briskly towards his waiting man, Grey Wind hulking along in his wake. When he reached them Billy came forward at once so he could resheath ice. His squire then moved to strap the sword to one of the horses, and Rob turned his attention to his own mount. He hauled himself up, taking hold of the reins and looking towards Billy to make sure he was up atop his own horse. When he could see that he was, Rob dug his heels lightly into the side of his horse to get him moving. "To Winterfell," he said, moving to the helm of the party, "as swiftly as the gods will allow us." Chapter 21, Interlude, A Sister's Lies. Notes. Hi everyone. A shorter chapter than usual, I'm afraid, because we're just off for a glance at the capital. We're with Jaime this time, rather than Cersei. Want to say a huge thanks to all who have been leaving kudos, it's much appreciated. And, to Blue Moon Blues, again, thank you so much for your lovely comment. I'm glad you enjoyed the snow chapter, and I hope you continue to enjoy the story. I can definitely confirm that yes, writing this story certainly is a joy for me. It's my first time writing Rob and Myrcella as a couple, and Myrcella at all in any detail, but it's definitely a pairing I will consider writing again in the future. Right ho, hope you all enjoy. Happy Smiley. Chapter text. Jaime. Your Grace, he knocked smartly on the wooden door of the king's chambers, his ears pricked for movement within. Come. Tommen's voice called irritably after a moment, and Jaime frowned slightly at his tone. Perhaps this would be harder than he imagined. He did as Tommen had bid him, entering the chambers and bowing his head to the young king. Tommen did not look happy when Jaime lifted his head and met his eyes once more. "What can I do for you, sir?" Tommen asked briskly, his eyes almost blazing. "The Queen Mother would speak with you, Your Grace," Jaime told him, and his gaze seemed to almost burn him at the words. "I have told my mother, I will not see her until she has apologized to the Queen." "Has she?" Tommen raised his brows and Jaime had to resist shuffling from foot to foot. He knew damn well that Cersei had not been anywhere near the Queen, and that there was little chance of the little Bulwer girl getting any kind of apology from his twin. "Your Grace," he began awkwardly, "the Queen Mother is beside herself. She meant no offense, she was merely trying to offer some guidance to her good daughter." Tommen snorted incredulously at that, and even Jaime had to admit that the explanation was ridiculous. You think my wife is so weak that she would be moved to tears by the offer of guidance? Tommen snapped at him, and Jaime grimaced. I know not what was said, your grace, he finally spoke, and Tommen's hard stare finally seemed to soften a little. She called my wife unworthy, Tommen told him calmly. She called her shameless for her acts of charity in the city. I will not tolerate anyone speaking to the queen in such a manner, especially not my own mother. Jaime sighed heavily at that. Cersei had been vague when she had ordered him to go to Tommen and demand her son receive a visit from her. She was drunk, Tommen said quietly when Jaime offered up no response, and he grimaced again. I think she is finding it hard, being away from Myrcella. Worrying about what is befalling her at Winterfell, he said, hoping that Tommen might find some sympathy for his mother. He was wrong. Tommen merely rolled his eyes. Myrcella is perfectly happy in the north, he said irritably. Her letters are full of joy and praise for her new home, and her new family. Jaime frowned at that. That was not the tale Cersei had spun him. That's wonderful, Jaime said, his mind already elsewhere. Cersei had already begged him, on her knees with tears streaming down her cheeks, to end Robb Stark's life for the sake of her daughter. She had told him how miserable Myrcella was, that Stark treated her little better than a whore, and that his family were intolerant of her. According to Cersei, Myrcella had begged and begged to come home, begged to be saved from a life of torment. Was there anything else, uncle? Tommen asked almost tiredly. Because if there isn't, I ought to be escorting the queen to dinner. Of course, your grace. Jaime bowed his head again. I will keep you no longer. With that he turned on his heel and made his way out of the chambers. He inclined his head to the two Kingsguard on duty outside and marched down the hallways towards his sister's chambers. After speaking with Tommen, he did not know what to believe. Was it possible that Myrcella was lying to her brother, sending him placating words so he would not fret and worry about her? He supposed it was, but he knew well enough how close Tommen and Myrcella had always been. Joffrey had been Cersei's pet, and the other children had merely been spares. His sister had never been good at showing affection towards them. She didn't feel the need to indulge them given that they were never meant to sit any throne. Now both of them did. Jaime almost snorted at that. How wrong Cersei had been, and she had left it too late with both of them to exert any influence over them. Myrcella bowed her head and did her duty. Tommen had done the same, listening intently to the advice of his grandfather and the council. Now he was of an age to make decisions by himself, and as far as Jaime could tell, he was making all the right ones. Jaime wondered if his twin's real problem was that she was no longer needed by anyone. Would that really motivate her to lie about Myrcella? It was no secret that she despised the Starks. Jaime himself had no affection for them, but imprisonment aside, he had let any lingering spite go a long time ago. Things could have ended up being a lot worse for him, and he supposed a few months in an exposed cage was a fair price to pay for crippling the Northern King's brother. He pulled his mind away from that fateful day, knocking firmly on the door to Cersei's chambers. There was no reply, and so he looked up and down the hallway before he let himself in. He called his sister's name as he made his way inside, glancing around for any sign of her. It seemed she was not here, and he sighed, turning on his heel to make his way back out before he paused. Before he could second-guess himself, he marched towards the writing desk that sat in the corner of the room. He opened up the drawers, rummaging inside and finding only blank parchment, quills, and ink pots. With a sigh he closed them again, deciding to leave things alone. His eye was caught by the paneling at the back of the desk though, and he moved his hand to it, pulling on the loose panel until it came away. There was a small space behind it, full of letters. He pulled them out, recognizing the snapped direwolf seal. Already he was doubting his sister's claims. Myrcella would still have her own seal, or she could have used a blank one, but she had chosen to stamp her letters with the Stark sigil. Why would she do that if she despised them that much? He shuffled the letters before picking one out at random, unfolding it carefully before taking in the neat script. It was no desperate, erratic scrawl. There were no blots on the parchment where her tears had fallen and smudged the ink. His stomach clenched hard. He had always known Cersei possessed a manipulative streak, but he had foolishly thought she would never use her own children for her own ends. Jaime read Myrcella's words carefully, trying to decipher any hidden meaning, but seeing none. Myrcella was not a devious girl. she would never think to write in code. She was so honest and good-natured that Tyrion had always wondered how she had been born to Cersei, and now Jaime was wondering the same thing. "I beg you, Mother, please do not think that Robb mistreats me. I know you must have been worried for me, but I promise you, there is no need. He is gentle and kind to me, and he allows me all the freedoms he can. I do not suffer at his hands, nor in his bed. Please, Mother, recognize the truth of my words and be at peace. The Starks are not our enemies, they are kin now, through me, and are kinder to me than I had any right to expect. Believe me, Mother, because I do not think I have any more words to persuade you of this truth, and I do not think I can bear to read another letter from you containing such poisonous assumptions. Robb cares for me, and I for him. Please be satisfied with that as I am, as it is more than I ever dared dream of." Jaime closed his eyes and sighed irritably. What in the name of the gods was Cersei thinking? What in the name of the gods had he been thinking to agree to help her without demanding to see Myrcilla's letters with his own eyes? She wanted Stark dead, even though she must know what his death would do to her daughter. Was her hatred of the Starks really that great that she would sacrifice her daughter's happiness and risk another war? Apparently so. He quickly folded the letter back up, and placed them all back where he had found them, replacing the loose panel and hiding them again. As he did so he heard the sound of the door opening and he moved away from the desk, seating himself on the sofa and determining to look casual. Cersei appeared in the next moment, looking surprised to see him. "Well, did you see Tommen?" she demanded of him, and he nodded. "He won't see you," he informed her, "not until you apologize to the Queen." She glared at him at that, and he decided to speak up again before she could berate him for his failure. "I've been thinking about Myrcilla." He rose up to his feet, and Cersei eyed him. "Have you changed your mind?" she asked him sharply, and he shook his head. "I think we should act now," he said. "I don't think we should wait for her to birth a son. If she is suffering this much at Stark's hands, then the sooner he is dead the better. She should not have to suffer spawning his child. Forget the North, Cersei, it will pass into the hands of a cripple and we will have nothing to fear from them. Let's just get our girl home." Cersei stared at him for a long moment, and he held her gaze, trying not to let his relief show on his face when she nodded her head. "Yes, you're right," she nodded frantically, "of course you're right. She isn't strong enough, she needs to come home now. You need to bring her home, Jaime, and kill that bastard for what he has done to her." It was his turn to nod then, walking towards her and holding her eyes. "How will you explain your absence?" she asked as he came to a halt mere inches from her. "I will ask Father to grant me leave," Jaime answered her. "I will tell him that I wish to consider my future. If he thinks there is a chance that I might reclaim my right as his heir, then he will let me go, I am certain of it. I will see him tomorrow, and then I will get the first ship to White Harbor. I will make it right, Cersei. I will ensure that Myrcilla gets the future she deserves before it's too late." Chapter 22:19, Duty. Notes. Hello all, sorry this is a little later than usual. Thanks for the comments on the first Jaime chapter. Seemed to be a little disagreement over whether or not he's a moron, but always good to have some differing feelings about. Personally, I'm of the blinded by love persuasion when it comes to Jaime's behavior, but then maybe that's because I'm a big, old romantic haha. Anyway, we're back at Winterfell this chapter, so normal service resuming for now. Big thanks for the kudos as well, before I forget. Hope everyone enjoys the new chapter. Happy Smiley. Chapter text. Myrcilla. Receiving word that Robb was a mere day away had put Myrcilla in high spirits as soon as the letter had been placed before her by the Maester at breakfast. He also had another letter for her, sealed with a lion. Only 2 people had written to her so far with that seal, her mother and her uncle Tyrion. Given that she was in such a good mood having read Robb's words, she was unwilling to risk souring it by snapping the second seal. There was a good chance it was from her mother, and so she just tucked it beneath her cloak and decided to forget about it for the day. She had more pressing things to deal with, such as overseeing the delivery of supplies to the keep, and making sure a feast was organized for Robb's return. He would not want a big fuss, and so she was determined just to have 2 courses. Never would there have been anything so frugal at the capital, even during the last winter, but, as Myrcilla kept reminding herself, the North was different. She took a sip of her spiced milk, before turning her head and meeting Lady Stark's gaze. Her good mother smiled encouragingly, and Myrcella was glad of the gesture, returning it easily. Today would be the first day that Myrcella took on the duties of the lady of the household entirely by herself. Over the last week she had been doing more and more, but Lady Stark had always been there, a step behind her, steering her gently in the right direction whenever she became unsure of herself. Today it would all be on her, and she was more than a little nervous at the prospect. She hoped it would go well, that she could manage it by herself. Not just for herself, but for Rob as well. She wanted him to see the progress she had made, she wanted him to know that she cared enough for Winterfell to ensure it was run smoothly. Lady Stark had done it all for so many years, and while she never complained, Myrcella couldn't help but imagine that she might be grateful for a lighter load of duties. It was the least she could do after how nice her good mother had always been to her, even when she had first arrived and been so sure that all the Starks would despise her. Lady Stark had always been kind, perhaps it was her kindness that had encouraged it in the others. It certainly could not have done any harm. Myrcella drained her milk in the next moment, resisting the urge to call for more. She had been unable to drink enough of it over that past week, but she was always unwilling to ask the servants any more than she needed to. Likely they would roll their eyes and tut at one another behind her back the moment she asked them to heat some more for her. She would just wait for luncheon, and hope that plenty was warmed so she could have more than one cupful. After rearranging the skirts of her dress she rose up to her feet, pulling her shawl from the back of her chair and draping it around her neck. "Where are you headed first?" Lady Stark asked her with a smile. "I am going to check on the builders in the gardens before the supplies come," Myrcella told her. "Don't linger too long, the sky looks like it is threatening snow," Lady Stark advised her, and Myrcella hummed her agreement. "I will be quick about it," she smiled, "and I will likely see you all at luncheon." The others all murmured their farewells at her words, and she moved along the back of the high table and stepped down off the dais. To the door she went, crossing the entrance hall and bringing a smile to her face for the guards. They gestured to the door of the keep, and she inclined her head, to which they sprang into action to open it up for her at once. A gust of cold air buffeted into the hall and she shuddered slightly. "Thank you, gentlemen," she inclined her head to them again, and they bowed her through the door, those stationed outside bowing their heads to her as well as she stepped out. The heavy doors were closed at once behind her, and Myrcella didn't linger, her steps brisk as she made her way across the courtyard and towards the gardens. Thankfully the builders were working on the wall by the gate so she didn't have to go far from the keep. Already the wind was swirling viciously around, freezing her cheeks despite how high she had pulled her shawl. One of the men looked up as she approached, alerting the others to her presence. She felt her cheeks flush warm as they all bowed lowly to her, hoping they wouldn't notice her blushes. Likely her cheeks were already reddened from the raw wind. "My queen," the man in charge greeted her, and she smiled at him. "I only came to see that you have everything you need," she told him, "though I can see you have made good progress. There cannot be much left to finish now." "No, my queen," he agreed with her, "not much at all. With luck we will be finished before those clouds deliver the snow they seem to be promising. Though, we have no other work to be getting on with once there is a break in the weather." He was looking at her hopefully, and she was loath to tell him that she could offer him no more work. She knew that he and his men would need coin more than ever now that winter was well and truly setting in. Likely they all had families, hungry mouths to feed and keep warm. "I myself cannot offer you anything else," but she continued before he could look too disappointed, "the king will return tomorrow, and I believe he may have something for you. Perhaps we could schedule an audience with him." She tried not to feel too pleased with herself when she saw the look of delight spread across his face. He readily agreed to meet with Rob, and Myrcella promised she would inform him of it as soon as he returned. Likely it wouldn't quite be the first thing she said to him, but she determined to remember to tell him about it. Hopefully he would allow them to begin work on expanding the stables or the stores. She had seen the accounts with Lady Stark and the steward a few days previously, and they seemed healthy enough to allow such work. Rob hadn't mentioned any desire to spend the coin elsewhere, so she was hopeful that the builders would remain happy with her after their audience with him. She finally made her way from where they were working, their thanks still ringing in her ears as she made her way back to the keep. Overseeing the delivery of the supplies turned out to be a surprisingly easy job. In fact, it seemed to Myrcella that she didn't have to do anything at all. The various tradesmen delivered the goods to the entrance hall, and the servants set about making sure they were taken to wherever they were stored. Ursula just stood at the side of the steward while he checked each item off his list, wondering what in the name of the gods she was needed for. Lady Stark had told her it was an important part of her weekly duty, and so Ursula had been expecting a little more. So far all she had done was exchange pleasantries with each trader who came up to the keep with their goods. The candlemaker had told her happily that his wife was expecting another child. She had congratulated him warmly, and after a glance at Byrne, decided to add another silver stag to his payment. The man had been even more delighted at that, thanking her profusely before making his way from the keep. Byrne had told her in an amused undertone that she ought not to have done that, telling her that all the traders would be claiming their wives with child once they got word of it. Ursula had told him in return that she thought the candles looked to be of excellent quality, and worthy of an extra coin. He had chuckled at that, and Ursula felt rather pleased with herself that she had built up some kind of friendly rapport with the steward. It was best this way, especially if she was going to continue conducting duties on her own. Finally, the last delivery came, 3 men bearing produce from the glass gardens. There was a little more than originally ordered since Ursula was organizing a welcoming feast for Rob and his returning men. The 3 that had brought the produce didn't seem to mind though, their cheeks rosy and their smiles easy as she spoke with them a while. Eventually the produce was all taken down to the kitchen stores, and the men departed the keep in a cheery manner. The guards closed the doors firmly behind them, and Ursula was grateful the stream of cold air was finally cut off. All the doors leading off the entrance hall had been closed for the afternoon, so not to let all the heat out of the keep while the delivery was in progress. Now they could be opened again, and hopefully the entrance hall would soon reclaim some of its warmth. "Well, that is us done for the day," my Queen Byrne said, rolling up his list of supplies and tucking them beneath his robes and furs. "I wonder that I ought to have done more to help," Ursula said, biting on her lower lip. "It seemed I just stood here all afternoon whilst the men did all the hard work and you checked off the list." "Your presence was invaluable, my queen," he told her, and she raised a brow skeptically. "Was it?" she asked him in an amused tone, and he smiled widely. "The reason it is so important for you to be here, is so that the lady of the household is seen by the tradesmen," he told her. "It is a little thing, but it cheers them to have a little contact with nobility. Usually they would only ever see their lord or lady in a formal setting. Of course, I could easily have overseen this without you, but the candlemaker would not be leaving this keep to spread the word of the kind-hearted queen if I had now, would he? I was here to please the people," Ursula said with a slight laugh. It was so obvious now that Byrne had said it. All she had done all afternoon was speak to each person who had come up to the keep with supplies for them. "It is a little thing, but if they know their efforts are appreciated by their rulers, then they are far more and contented and happy," Byrne elaborated. "After all, is that not what we all want, a little appreciation?" "You are very well appreciated," Byrne Ursula told him knowingly, and he smiled sheepishly. "Now, if we are done for the day, I will not keep you any longer," she continued, and he stepped back from her and bowed lowly. "My queen," he straightened up, inclining his head to her once more before turning and making his way down the hallway towards his own quarters. Ursula smiled slightly as she watched him go, thinking on what he had said to her. Hopefully he was right. Hopefully the candlemaker and the other traders would have some nice words to say about her when they returned home to their families. Even just one kind word would be appreciated by her. Perhaps some of it would even filter through to the servants. It was wishful thinking, but it would do no harm to be a little optimistic. Ursula sighed, turning on her heel and deciding she would go to the library and sit with Bran for a while before dinner. Rickon might well be there too. He was struggling with his history, and the Maester had ordered him to spend more time reading up on it. At least his numbers had improved. Lady Stark had been despairing of him, but he seemed to have finally grasped them. Ursula had helped him where she could, but she was hardly an expert when it came to sums. She much preferred helping him with his history. It had been something that had always fascinated her. Before she could turn down the hallway that led to the library though, she heard the door of the keep open again and turned to see who else had come. It was Tom, the baker, a woman following in behind him. Both of them carried a box, and Ursula smiled, knowing what the contents would be. She had asked Lady Stark what Rob's favorite treats were, and she had told her that he had always enjoyed apple and cinnamon cake. Armed with that information, she had asked Tom to bake some when he had come up to deliver the bread one morning. He had promised to do so, and now it appeared he had delivered on his promise. As she approached, he bowed his head, as did the woman who had come to a halt at his side. "My queen," Tom greeted her, "I have what you asked for, and a little something else, if it please you." "I am sure it will," she smiled easily at him, "though I do hope you did not go to any trouble. There must be more than enough for you to contend with, given how many more have arrived in Winter Town in the past days." It was true enough, more and more houses were occupied in the surrounding town now. In fact, it was difficult to find a house where smoke was not rising up from the chimney. "It was no trouble, my queen," he told her, "it is a plum tart, freshly made. I hope it is to your liking." "I cannot wait to try it," Ursula told him. Plums were not her favorite fruit, but Tom had gone to a lot of effort, and so she determined she would have some for her sweet course tonight. She would have the tart served up at the high table. Between them all, she imagined there would only be crumb left by the end of the night. "Thank you very much for bringing these," Ursula said, holding out her hands to receive the box from him. "It was trouble," Tom said. "Can I aid you, my queen?" he asked, as she turned towards his female companion. "I am sure the other will balance on top," she responded, but one of the guards was already approaching. "Allow me, my queen," he said, and before she knew it, he had taken the box from her, and from the woman. "Would you like them delivered to the kitchens?" he asked her, and she nodded. "Yes, thank you," she confirmed, and he bowed his head. "Any instruction?" he asked next. She instructed him to ask that the plum tart be served tonight, but that the apple cake be saved for the king's return. He promised to pass on her instruction, before turning to do as he was bid, Ursula calling out her thanks again to his retreating back. "Forgive me, we have not been introduced," she smiled at Tom's companion when she turned her attention back to them. "Forgive me, my queen," Tom was speaking again at once, "this is my wife, Ada." Ada dropped down into an elegant curtsy at the introduction, her cloak parting slightly as she did, to reveal her rounded stomach. "It is a pleasure to meet you, my queen," Ada smiled as she rose back up to her feet, and Ursula returned the gesture. "The pleasure is mine, I'm sure," she said, pleased at finally finding a woman who didn't fix her with a hard stare. "And, might I offer my congratulations?" She nodded down towards Ada's stomach. "Thank you, my queen," Ada said, bowing her head, and smiling again. "Is it your first child?" Ursula asked, keen to continue the conversation since the woman appeared warm towards her. "It is our first," Ada answered her, "though I already have 2 boys from my first marriage." "Oh," Ursula said, unsure of what else to say. It appeared her desire to continue speaking with Tom and Ada had led her to stumble upon a subject she sensed might be rather sensitive. "He died," Ada said quickly, "during the war, but myself and my children are lucky indeed that Tom found us." There was clear affection in her tone, and her gaze tilted towards her husband, a softness in her eyes. "Though I would insist that I am the lucky one," Tom said adoringly, and Ursula's heart panged painfully for Rob. "Tomorrow," she reminded herself, smiling serenely at the happy couple before her. "Well, perhaps you are both lucky to have found one another despite harder times," Ursula said, and they both nodded their agreement. "Ursula!" Lady Stark called out behind her before either Tom or Ada could speak again, and Ursula turned her head to smile at her good mother. "Lady Stark," she greeted warmly, her smile faltering slightly when she saw the slight look of panic in the older woman's eyes. "Is everything all right?" Ursula asked anxiously, already thinking the worst. That word had come from Rob. That he was delayed. Worse, that something had happened to him. Of course, her good mother's smile looked slightly forced. "I had just thought perhaps you would accompany me for dinner." "We would not keep you any longer, my queen," Tom spoke up as Ursula looked between Lady Stark and the young couple she had been happily conversing with. "Oh, of course, I would not keep you either," she said quickly, "though I must thank you again, for the cake, and for taking the time to trouble yourself with my company. It was a pleasure to meet you, Ada." "Thank you, my queen," Ada curtsied again, and Ursula wondered if she was imagining it, or if the woman was deliberately avoiding looking at Lady Stark. "Yes, thank you," Tom reiterated, bowing his head before he placed his hand on the small of his wife's back and steered her towards the main door of the keep. "Are you sure everything's all right, Lady Stark?" Ursula asked her, a slight frown setting into her forehead as she watched her good mother watch Tom and Ada's retreat. Of course her good mother assured her, though Ursula would swear that she still looked rather strained. She searched in her mind for any reason why there might be a problem between her and the baker. As far as she could remember, she had been perfectly pleasant to Tom when they had spoken with him last week. Perhaps it was Ada, then. Though, for the life of her, Ursula could not think of any reason Lady Stark would have to hold animosity towards her. She seemed a lovely woman who had clearly had a hard time in her life, but was now making a happy future for herself. Perhaps she was just being paranoid. Lady Stark could be feeling the strain from any number of things. Likely it was just a coincidence. Shall we go into dinner then? Ursula asked expectantly, and her good mother seemed to smile more easily. Yes, let's, she said, the usual warmth back in her tones as she took hold of Ursula's arm and steered her towards the dining hall. We have plum tart for our sweet course tonight, Ursula informed her good mother as they ambled into the hall. That sounds just lovely, Lady Stark said, and Ursula smiled. How did you get on today? Lady Stark asked her as they settled themselves down at the high table. Well enough, I think, Ursula said, once again making sure she smiled brightly at the servants and getting nothing but hard stares back. Ignore them, Lady Stark said as they bustled away again, they will get used to you eventually. When I first arrived here they were just the same. Northerners are fiercely loyal, but they can also be stubborn and unforgiving. Try not to take it personally. Ursula smiled wryly. It was very difficult not to take it personally. She wondered if Lady Stark was being completely honest with her. There was no reason she could think of why the servants would take against her. She decided to push on and ask after a moment. It had been mentioned now after all, likely it would not be a big secret to stumble upon. What cause did they have not to like you, she asked, and her good mother laughed slightly. I'm a southerner, Lady Stark told her, and Ursula frowned. Surely, she began, but Lady Stark cut across her to elaborate. Before me, no Lord Stark had ever taken a wife who was not of the North, her good mother explained, but Ned did, and afterwards he fought a war. The two were not implicitly linked, of course, but it meant I did not come here to Winterfell until over a year after our wedding. Rob was already born, so I imagined the people might be happy I had delivered them an heir. But they weren't. Ursula asked her, still unable to understand why the servants would have taken against her. They were at first, Lady Stark nodded, but it wasn't long before building started on the September. You see, before Ned married me, there was no September here at Winterfell. He had it built for me so I could continue to worship my gods. I suppose the people didn't like that, their lady not taking on the worship of the old gods. They do not have anything against the seven, not really, nor those who worship them, but their way is the old way. I suppose it just took them a little getting used to. In the end I proved myself to them, I think. Lady Stark smiled amusedly at the end, and Ursula laughed slightly. She had seen the adoration that the people bestowed on her good mother, it had never crossed her mind that it had not always been the case. Still, she could not help but think that it would be a lot harder for her to win them over. As though reading her mind, Lady Stark spoke up again. It will take time, she said softly, but they will not look unfavorably on you forever, not when they realize all that you are doing that is good. They are stubborn, as I said, but they are loyal to Rob. Once they feel you have earned it, they will be loyal to you too. But until then I suppose I just have to sit back and smile, Ursula said wryly, and Lady Stark reached out to pat her hand affectionately. There are far worse things to endure, believe me, she said, her tone tinged with sadness, and Ursula felt a pang of guilt for being so sullen about the servants not liking her. One glance at her good mother in her usual black reminded her that she had lost a lot less than others during the wars. Everyone that she cared about still lived, thank the gods. I'm sorry, Ursula said sincerely, and Lady Stark nodded, a determined smile coming to her lips. Over 8 years, she said, and yet sometimes, it feels like he was taken from me yesterday. All this talk of the servants reminded me of a long time ago, that's all. You have nothing to be sorry for. Ursula smiled, her turn now to reach for Lady Stark's hand and offer her some comfort. Before she could help it, she was wondering if she would be the same. If she would wear black for the rest of her days if Rob was suddenly taken from her too soon. She almost shuddered at the thought, though the dining hall was perfectly well. He would be back tomorrow, and she would have him in her arms again. She would not dwell on dark things, not when she had somehow managed to stumble upon such happiness. Chapter 23, XX, Home Sweet Home. Notes. Hey guys. Thanks as always for the kudos and comment. Rob is back this chapter, hope you all enjoy. Happy smiley. Chapter text. Rob. It was early evening when he and his small band of men clattered into the courtyard of Winterfell. At once his eyes pulled to the main doors of the keep, seeing his mother, Arya, and Rickon all stood out waiting for him. He frowned slightly, noting Myrcilla's absence, and dismounted at once. His thanks to Billy as he took the reins of his horse were distracted, his mind fixed on discovering the whereabouts of his wife. Before he could ask, he found himself embraced by his mother. "Welcome home," she said happily, beaming at him when she pulled away. "Cold enough for you?" Arya asked him with a smirk, and he swatted at her. "Where's Myrcilla?" he asked, ignoring his sister's question. "When they called down that you were approaching, she went in to make sure hot water was brought up for you," his mother told him, and he felt his tensed stomach relax. She had hoped to get back out before you arrived, but clearly she was unsuccessful. "Well, I suppose I ought to go and find her then," Rob said, kissing his mother's cheek, before sidestepping her. He ruffled Arya and Rickon's hair on the way past, taking the steps up to the main doors 2 at a time. The guards bowed him through, and he gave them his thanks, bypassing the main stairs to head for the back ones which would find him at his and Myrcilla's chambers more quickly. He took them 2 at a time as well, emerging in the above hallway, a short distance from their chambers. As he turned towards them, he recognized the familiar golden head of his wife retreating down the other way. Clearly she was headed towards the main stairs, and he hurried after her at once. "And where do you think you're going?" he asked when he was mere feet away, his hands reaching out for her waist. She shrieked in surprise, turning around to face him with wide eyes. It only took a second for her to smile, and in the next moment she had thrown her arms around his neck. He held her tightly against him, burying his head in the crook of her neck and breathing her in. By the gods, he had missed her. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," she pulled back from him slightly so their eyes could meet. "I thought I would have enough time." "There is nothing to apologize for, I have you here now," he replied, and she smiled up at him again. He couldn't help but lean in and capture her lips, then, slowly teasing them apart so he could deepen their kiss. A hum of undeniable satisfaction left her, and before he knew it he had her pressed up against the wall, her fingertips digging into his scalp as she fisted her hands in his hair. She pulled away from the kiss with a gasp in the next moment, and Rob took up his cause at her neck instead. He delighted in the little murmurs of pleasure that left her as he nibbled slightly on her delicate skin. "Your bath will get cold," she stuttered out as he continued his ministrations, his hands slipping down to the curves of her hips. He pressed a kiss behind her ear in response, before somehow summoning the strength to pull back from her. "I am very tired, you know," he told her in an amused tone, his eyes full of intent. "Is that right?" she asked him with a raised brow, clearly reading his mood with ease. "Weary," he confirmed, "I'm not sure I have the strength to bathe myself." Perhaps I ought to call Billy," she suggested, and he nipped at her waist, delighting in the slight giggles that came from her mouth. "I would prefer a woman's touch," he practically growled at her, pulling on her hips so they pressed closer to his own. "Any woman," she responded, that brow raised again, and he kissed her hard for a moment. "My wife," the 2 words dripped with lust, and she shuddered in his arms, her own eyes darkened with desire. "I'm sure that can be arranged," she whispered, her warm, sweet breath teasing his lips. "See that it is," he told her, pressing his lips firmly to her forehead before somehow managing to pull himself away from her. Thankfully it was only a short walk back to their chambers, and he tugged Myrcilla in after him, sorely tempted to ignore the bath and drag her right to their bed. It looked so inviting, and so did his wife. She seemed to have other ideas though, somehow slipping away from him and moving to pour some wine. He exhaled deeply. It was good to be back. "Don't be too long," he told Myrcilla in mock warning as he made his way behind the screen that concealed the bathtub. It was emitting waves of steam, and he sighed in contentment, already imagining the warmth relieving his aching muscles and cold bones. "Patience is a virtue, Your Grace," Myrcilla responded to him as he unwound his furs and tossed them aside before unclasping his cloak and letting it fall to the floor. "Did your Septa teach you that?" he asked her, pulling on the laces of his doublet. "She did," she confirmed, Did no one ever think to teach you? He chuckled at that, shrugging out of his doublet before bending to unlace his boots. No, he answered simply, hearing his wife hum knowingly in response. I thought as much, she commented, as he rid himself of his boots, straightening up to tug his tunic up and over his head. He unlaced his breeches next, ridding himself of them before finally stepping into the water. A groan of relief left him as he sank down into the steaming warmth, his eyes closing in satisfaction. He had been right, it was just the thing to soothe away the near week of riding he had undertaken to get back. When he opened his eyes again, Ursula was standing at the foot of the bathtub, his robe tied incredibly loosely around her waist and a cup of wine in each hand. She extended one out to him, and he took it with thanks, his eyes not leaving her. To your safe return, she raised her own cup to him, and he did the same. To us being together again, he added his own words, and she smiled widely before taking a sip from her cup. He took a long drink from his own, almost draining half of it, before he lowered it again. Ursula set her own down on the side table nearby before turning her attention back to him. Are you still feeling weary? She asked him, slowly tugging on the tie that was barely keeping his robe from revealing her glorious body to him. Very, he confirmed, and the robe fell open in the next moment. She shrugged it from her creamy shoulders before moving slowly towards the bathtub. Rob could not move his eyes away from her, unable to help looking her up and down. It had been far too long since he had been in the presence of her perfection. Quickly, he drained the rest of his wine, allowing the empty cup to drop to the floor when he was finished, before his eyes found her again. He shifted himself further up in the tub as she came closer, stepping carefully into the water in the next moment. Her dainty little feet came to rest on either side of his thighs, and he couldn't help but run his hands slowly up her calves as she sank down until she came to rest astride him. He was already hard for her, and he knew she knew it from the way her teeth sank into her bottom lip as she shifted her hips slightly against him. He let his hands travel further, slipping over her smooth thighs, his thumbs slowly massaging against her soft skin. Her own hands traveled up his arms, mimicking the action of his thumbs when she reached his shoulders. Gods, he had missed her touch. He slipped his hands up to her hips, pulling her closer against him and eliciting a gasp from her slightly parted lips. It's good to be home, he told her, moving his hands slowly up her back, which arched under his touch. Her breasts came within kissing distance at her action, and he would be fooled to ignore them. I missed you, it was half whisper, half gasp that came from her mouth as he occupied himself at her breast. He teased one of her hardened butts between his teeth, and she moaned softly, her fingernails pinching crescents into his shoulders. Show me, he murmured against her skin, lapping his way up the valley of her breasts until he could latch onto the sensitive skin of her neck once more. Ursula lifted her hips slightly at his command, her hands leaving his shoulders and slipping slowly down over his chest and lower towards his stomach. His length twitched as her touch found him, and he groaned out against her softness as she guided him into her sweet warmth. She exhaled deeply as she sank down onto the length of him, and he allowed his hands to roam back down towards her hips. Ursula tilted her head back as she began to slowly rock back and forth, her hands resting on his chest as his came to her hips to guide her movements. He kept her pace slow, wanting to savor her for as long as possible. Her head tilted back even further as they continued, irresistibly low moans leaving her beautiful lips. What else could he do but lean forwards and press kisses all the way up the exposed flesh of her neck? Her nails pinched into his chest in response, her head lifting back up. He pulled his own back, their eyes meeting with a frightening intensity. It was only a second. Perhaps two, and then her lips had found his, and he released a groan into her glorious mouth as her thighs twitched around him. She was already so close, and he was glad of it because he didn't know how much longer he could hold on. One of his hands came up to fist in the hair at the base of her neck, their kiss becoming more furious, her hips rocking that little bit faster. His other hand he slipped between them, to touch her the way she always liked. The way that always made her body shake and writhe. The way that had desperate, wanton little cries leaving her mouth. The way that always made her utter his name pleadingly as he brought her closer and closer to her release. He wasn't disappointed. Her thighs clenched tighter around him, her lips pulling back from his. Each gasp for air was accompanied by a cry of anticipation. With each rock of her hips she grew louder and more desperate, and Rob bucked his own hips up beneath her, ensuring he gave her absolutely all of him. It appeared that was enough, a strangled cry leaving her before she gasped out his name, her body trembling, limply falling forwards against his as she clenched him to his own end. She was panting against his shoulder, and his own breathing was coming sharply as he placed his hands on her back and rubbed soothingly up and down the soft expanse. Little tremors were still running through her body, and he could still feel her tightening around him every other moment. He let out a long breath of satisfaction, before pressing his lips firmly to her shoulder. His action seemed to rouse her, her golden head slowly lifting up from his shoulder. Their eyes met, and they smiled in unison, her eyes lighting up as she continued to pull air through her lips more quickly than usual. "Welcome home," she whispered, and a near breathless laugh left him as she wrapped her arms around his neck. "Most welcome," he murmured after catching his breath. "Perhaps I ought to go away more often." Rob made his way down to the dining hall for dinner, feeling utterly content and satiated. He had left Ursula to get ready on her own after finally managing to crawl out of bed and into his own clothes. If he had waited for her, then he didn't think she would have got much further than slipping out of the sheets and furs before he dragged her back beneath them. He was late down to dinner as it was, and he was feeling utterly exhausted, but she was more than worth it. His family were already present, and he smiled widely at them as he made his way to the center of the high table, an undoubted spring in his step. "Evening," he said to them as he sat himself down, his hands moving up to straighten his doublet. "Is Ursula not joining us?" his mother asked as he reached forwards to pour himself a cup of wine. "She'll be here soon enough, fixing her hair," he told her. It wasn't a complete lie, he supposed. His mother hummed in response, but said no more as Rob began pulling dinner onto his plate. "Don't eat too much," his mother warned him. "Ursula has arranged a sweet course especially for you." "Has she now?" Rob said in an amused tone, unable to help thinking that his wife had already served up a sweet course for him. "She has," his mother confirmed as he tucked into his meal. No one spoke for a while, as Rob demolished half his plate in one sitting, suddenly aware of exactly how hungry he was. So he spoke up after gulping down some wine. "What have you all been occupying yourselves with in my absence?" "I've been learning the names of the old Targaryen dragons," Rickon piped up, and Rob nodded, taking another sip of wine. Dragons weren't exactly a favored topic of conversation, but he remembered the Maester teaching them all about them when he was a boy. "And how many have you learned so far?" he asked his youngest brother. "Over 30, I think," Rickon told him, and he smiled at him. "That's good, Rickon," he praised, and his little brother looked delighted. "What about you, Bran? Have you discovered anything yet that will change the world?" Rob asked, eyeing his brother, and seeing an amused smile twitching up at his lips. "I've been looking more closely at plants with the Maester," Bran told him. "I think there are new medicines just waiting to be discovered and brewed." "That would be useful indeed, no doubt," Rob said, and Bran nodded his agreement. "What about you?" he nodded towards Arya. "You're being strangely quiet. Did your tongue fall out while I was away? Or have you just done nothing but spar?" From his mother's pursed lips and Arya's sly grin he knew well enough that his sister had likely spent the majority of her time in the tiltyard. "Sir Roderick says I could be master at arms when he grows too old for the post," Arya told him, and he snorted in a rather undignified manner. "I bet he said no such thing," Rob practically cackled, shoveling another mouthful of food into his mouth. "He did," Arya insisted, and Bran and Rickon dissolved into laughter on Rob's other side. Arya was growing red in the face and Rob noted that even their mother was trying to hide an amused smile. "Arya," Rob managed when he had swallowed down his mouthful and his amusement, "I have no doubt you are skilled enough with the sword, but you have no lasting patience." "So," she shot back at him indignantly, and he took a drink of wine before answering her. So Rob rolled his eyes at her. "How do you suppose to teach young boys how to wield a sword when you will lose your temper with them for being hopeless?" Arya glowered at him, stabbing a piece of meat with her fork far harder than was necessary. "I could so do it," she muttered to her plate, and Rob sighed, deciding to take pity on her. "Why don't you take a few of the boys from the town under your wing?" he suggested to his sister. "See if you can improve your patience with them. And for the love of the gods, Arya, will you just try and remember that they are children, and that we all had to start from scratch once upon a time. They will not get good overnight, you need to work with them nicely." "I can be nice," Arya said, in a tone that suggested that she had never even heard of the word. "You might want to tell your face that," Bran told her, and Rob pressed his lips together tightly to stop himself from laughing. Rukan didn't have the restraint, and he and Bran dissolved into hysterics at the murderous look that crossed Arya's face. Robb reached for the wine again, noticing his mother studiously drinking hers as he did so. "You all sound like you're having fun." Myrcilla's amused tone sounded just behind him, and in the next moment she was slipping elegantly into the chair at his side. "Arya is taking on a new role," Robb told her, trying to use his most serious tone as he could sense his sister was close to losing her temper. "Oh, what's that?" Myrcilla turned her attention to Arya, whose tense features softened a little at the genuine curiosity in Myrcilla's voice. "I'm going to be training some of the boys from the town to wield a sword properly," Arya told her, and Myrcilla smiled. "What a lovely idea," she said happily. "I suppose not many of the small folk get the opportunity to be trained with lords, or ladies," she added quickly, and a satisfied smile spread across Arya's face. "See, Myrcilla thinks I'm nice," Arya told Robb pointedly, and he rolled his eyes. "Are we forgetting that it was my idea?" he shot back at her, and she stuck her tongue out. "Well, I think you're both lovely," Myrcilla said happily, before turning her attention to serving some dinner onto her empty plate. "Very diplomatic, my queen," Robb said in an amused tone, and a light blush rose up on her cheeks as he whispered his fingers along the back of her hand for a moment. "Diplomacy is very important," she responded, and he grinned. "Shall I pour you some wine?" he asked her, and to his surprise she shook her head. "I have rather lost my appetite for it," she told him. "I have grown rather fond of that spiced milk. It is all I ever seem to want." Robb chuckled slightly at that, reaching further down the table for the milk flagon. Usually it was only Rukan who indulged in it, but he filled Myrcilla's cup to the brim, earning him a beaming smile and thanks from her. He settled back down in his chair, letting out a happy sigh as she started on her own dinner. "I do hope you are not too full," his wife commented after a while. "I have ordered a sweet course especially for your homecoming." "So I've heard," Robb returned. "Don't worry, I have not overindulged." She seemed satisfied with his answer, smiling happily at him before she moved to sip down some of her milk. The servants were already moving through the hall, clearing away the empty dinner plates. Myrcilla was still only part way through her meal, and Robb noted that she began to eat slightly more quickly. He moved his hand to her back and held it there a moment. "Take your time," he told her quietly, but if anything her pace increased even more. They were coming along the high table now, clearing all their plates. He kept his eyes on them, noting the cold, hard stares that Myrcilla was earning when they looked to see her still eating. It was tempting to open his mouth and tell them to show more respect for their queen, but his mother caught his eye as his brow furrowed, her head shaking ever so slightly. He sighed again, irritably this time. His mother smiled at him sympathetically on hearing it, and he moved his eyes back to the servants. Those furthest away were clearly muttering to one another, and he bristled. He knew chastising them would be a bad idea. They had to learn to respect and show kindness to Myrcilla by themselves. If he forced them into it, then likely they would only grow more resentful towards her. It irritated him, but there was nothing he could do about it that would not make it worse. Myrcilla was a naturally kind and warm-hearted person. Eventually he imagined they would thaw towards her. For now he would just have to try and endure the hostility they showed towards her and try not to let it get to him. She placed her knife and fork down against her plate in the next moment, her meal not finished. One of the servants came forwards at once. "Are you finished, my queen?" she asked rather stiffly, and Robb bit his tongue, knowing his own gaze was hard as he fixed his eyes on the woman. "Yes, thank you." Myrcilla's voice was all warmth and politeness, a smile on her face. She got nothing in return, and Robb clenched his fist against the arm of his chair. If they were this dismissive of her in his presence, then he dreaded to think what she had had to put up with in his absence. She sat back in her chair in the next moment and he immediately reached out to take her hand. She turned her smile on him, her eyes soft on his. He returned her smile, rubbing his thumb against the back of her hand. "You should have taken your time," he told her with raised brows, and she sighed. "And give them more to whisper about behind their hands?" she asked him pointedly, and he shook his head. "It's fine," she stressed before he could say any more, but he was still irked, his head imagining the worst of what they could be saying about his wife. "They will learn to treat their queen with more respect if they wish to keep their positions." Robb almost snarled, and he could feel his mother's eyes turn on him as Myrcilla's widened. "Promise me you won't." She gripped his hand harder. "It will only make things worse. Please, Robb." Her eyes were wide and insistent, as she twisted in her chair so she could meet his gaze. "It's getting better," she told him, nodding her head. "The servants might still be cold, but the townsfolk have been nice to me. Tom and his wife were here yesterday, and they were lovely." Rob stiffened slightly at that, feeling his mother do the same on his other side. While he was pleased that the townsfolk were warming towards Ursula, he could do without her striking up a friendship with Ada. And Ursula continued, "The builders are happy enough with me. They will be even happier if you allow them to begin work on expanding the stables," she tailed off, her tone persuasive and her eyes wide and hopeful. "I intend to," he told her, and she looked delighted. "Good," she said happily. "Now why don't we just enjoy the rest of your homecoming meal?" "Ignore them, Rob." She squeezed his hand. "I have learned to." "Very well," he huffed, still irritated but placated for the most part. Ursula didn't seem too upset by the behavior of the servants, and so he would do nothing for now. They were returning to the hall now, some with flagons of wine to replace the empty ones along the tables, and two with plates of cakes. They were set down at the high table, and Rob smiled at once, recognizing the delicious smell they were emitting. "Apple and cinnamon," he said knowingly, his smile widening as Ursula nodded her head. "I was reliably informed that they were your favorite," she told him. Very reliably, he agreed with her, guessing that his mother must have told her. "They look wonderful," he added, moving to grab a few before his siblings could demolish them. "Well, I hope you enjoy them," Ursula smiled, caressing the back of his hand for a moment before she too moved to take one of the cakes. "I'm sure I will," Rob smiled, before he bit into one of the soft cakes. It tasted heavenly, and he knew he would likely be able to eat several more of them. He reclined back in his chair as he enjoyed his favorite sweet treat, thinking about just how happy he was to be home again. Chapter 24, XXI, Fear Inside. Notes. Well, thank you all so much. The kudos has gone over 600, which is just crazy to me, but thank you, thank you, thank you. Shame that 1000 kudos didn't show up. Gabby Winter winking smiley, haha, I jest. Big thanks for your comment, and to a random person and Ghost Glowlight, you three have excellent detective skills, winking smiley. Anywho, hope you all enjoy the new installment. Happy smiley. Chapter text. Ursula. Ursula was sat happily talking with Rob about nothing of importance when it hit her. One of the servants had laid out a tray of crispy bacon and she balked, her hand coming up to her mouth as she almost gagged. "Take it," Rob said at once, waving the tray away. Thankfully the serving girl did as she was bid quickly, not even pausing to fix Ursula with her usual disdainful look. She moved her hand away from her mouth when she was safely out of sight, taking a shuddering breath. "Are you all right?" Rob asked her concernedly, and she nodded her head. "I'm fine now, I'm sorry," she said, "I don't know what came over me." "Here, I'll get you some water," Rob said, already reaching for the flagon when she stopped him. "I'd rather milk," she told him, and he moved his hand to that instead. He carefully poured her a measure, and she thanked him, reaching out to begin sipping it down slowly. She could feel his eyes boring into her as she drank, but he didn't say a word until she had set her cup down again. "Perhaps you ought to see the maester," he suggested, but she shook her head. "I feel fine now," she assured him, but he did not look placated, a strange look in his eyes. She felt slightly uncomfortable under his piercing gaze, and so she picked up her cup again and drank down some more of the milk. "You know, there may be a reason for your change in appetite," Rob said slowly, almost tentatively. She set her cup down again, studiously avoiding his gaze. "What's that?" she asked him, hoping her voice sounded normal, though her heart was pounding wildly in her chest. "You could be with child," he said quietly, and she swallowed hard. "Ursula," he questioned her, but still she couldn't bring herself to look at him. "Are you?" he pressed her, and she shook her head automatically. "Are you certain of that?" His tone was almost urgent now, and she took in a shuddering breath. "No," she finally said, her voice shaking. "Would it really be so terrible?" he asked her, definite irritation seeping into his tone now. "Of course not," she shook her head in protest. "Why would you even think to ask that?" "Perhaps because you have been unable to look at me since I mentioned it," he retorted heatedly, and she couldn't help but curl her fingers back towards her palms. "You're being ridiculous," she told him as calmly as she could manage, and from the corner of her eye she saw him turn away from her, his eyes blazing. She'd angered him now with her evasiveness. It was something she had promised herself many years ago that she would not do. She had promised herself that she would never give him cause to be angry with her, no matter what state their marriage was in. Since they had grown so happy together, she had thought that keeping that promise would be easy. What she hadn't considered was his intuitiveness. Her suspicions had been aroused during his second absence. Before, really. She had bled after their marriage, while he was away dealing with matters at Torrens Square. Since he had returned though, her moon's blood had failed to visit her. It ought to have done before he had ridden out to Long Lake, but it hadn't, and it had still not come. She knew what it meant. She knew damn well what it meant, and it seemed that Rob had worked it out too. He had been back less than a day and he had already realized. She took a shuddering breath, trying to find the right words for him, but he appeared to have found his voice too. I thought you might at least be a little pleased at the prospect. His voice was quiet, but accusing and almost cold. It almost made her flinch away from him. Of course I am, she said, though she was not even convinced by her own words. Rob wasn't either, it was evident from the incredulous snort that left him. No, you're not, he said bitterly, practically throwing his fork down against his plate. This time she really did flinch. I thought we were happy, he accused her, his eyes turning on her and forcing her own to look down at her fidgeting hands. We are, she told him firmly, her fingers curling back against her palms again. Try looking me in the eye when you say that, he hissed at her, it might make it more convincing. Tears stung her eyes at that, and she closed them tight shut to try and avoid crying here in the middle of the dining hall. She was only grateful that it was mostly deserted. That she and Rob had been so late coming to break their fast that most people were gone already. They were alone up at the high table, thank the gods. I am happy with you, she told him, every word shaking with suppressed emotion. But not happy to bear my child. She had never heard him so bitter, and it hurt. Don't you dare say that. She finally lifted her head. Don't you ever say that, not after what you, she cut off, shaking her head. His hand came to her wrist, wrapping around it almost too tightly. After I what? He demanded of her, and she pulled her wrist free of his grip. You're hurting me, she told him, and for a moment a look of regret flashed in his eyes. Why are you being like this? He asked her, his tone softer now. I thought you would be happy at the prospect of us having a family. Isn't that what you want? Of course it's what I want, she snapped at him, her nails digging hard into her palm. Then why are you doing this? He asked her gently, prizing her fingers away from her palm. His tender touch was too much. She pulled her hand away from him, rising up from the table quickly. Ursula, don't, he said warningly, but she ignored him, striding as quickly as she could without running. She didn't stop until she was out of the dining hall, across the entrance hall and bowed out of the keep by the guards. It was freezing outside, and she had no cloak nor furs about her. Her teeth chattered as she made her way across the courtyard, her eyes fixed on her destination. If she were lucky, Rob would not think to look for her there right away. She scurried up the steps of the September, glancing around to make sure that no one was paying her any mind. They didn't appear to be, and so she cracked the door open just wide enough to slip inside, closing it firmly behind her and leaning back against the solid wood, a long breath of relief leaving her. Guilt was seeping through her veins now, her pounding heart pumping it quickly through every inch of her body. Rob was angry with her, and she couldn't blame him. He was right. It should have been a happy moment. They should both have been thrilled, smiles so wide they could have cracked their faces. He would have held her, kissed her, looked on her adoringly. Tears leaked from her eyes before she could stop them, and she brushed them impatiently away and walked shakily towards the altar. Her eyes lingered on the statue of the mother, her hand coming to rest against her still unchanged stomach. She would change soon enough, if all went as it should. A sob rose up before she could stop it, and she sank down to her knees in front of the mother and prayed harder than she had ever prayed before. She tiptoed back into the keep when dusk began to settle. Guilt was set in deep now. She knew Rob had been looking for her. The maester had told her so when she had finally gone up to see him when her knees were aching from being knelt on the stone floor of the September for so long. When she had re-entered the keep though, it appeared that there was no one around save the guards. She wondered where Rob might be. If perhaps he was waiting up in their chambers for her to finally come back. For a moment she considered heading right for the stairs, but then she decided to check his study first. Just in case. She walked quietly down the hallway that led her there, seeing the door standing slightly ajar. It seemed she had been right to come here first after all. She considered knocking, but then decided just to push the door open. He was in there, sat behind the desk with his head in his hands. She swallowed hard, knowing it was her doing. "I'm sorry," she said, and he jumped, his head lifting up and his eyes meeting hers. She swallowed hard, somehow holding his gaze. "I'm frightened," she confessed to him, voice barely more than a whisper. This time he moved, pushing back from the desk and striding towards her. In the blink of an eye she was folded into his arms and she clung to him, tears leaking from her eyes again as he rocked her gently, his lips pressing to the top of her head. "What are you frightened of?" he asked her, his soft tone laced with urgency. It only served to make her cry harder, clutching him even closer and sobbing into his chest. He rubbed his hand up and down her back, the other stroking through her hair until she eventually began to calm. After what seemed like forever she felt she could breathe evenly again, though she kept her face pressed into his chest. "I'm frightened I will be like my mother," she told him lowly, her voice muffled by his doublet. "I'm scared it won't live," she continued before he could comment. "I'm scared it will die inside me. I'm scared it will kill me. I'm afraid that winter will be too much for such a tiny, precious thing. I worry that I won't be good enough, that even if all goes well I will never be good enough." She could say no more as her emotions were rising up in her again. Rob hushed her gently, his hand still tenderly rubbing up and down her back. "You're nothing like your mother," he told her firmly, and she choked on a sob. "I cannot promise you anything else, but I can promise you that," he continued, gently prizing her away from him and cupping her tear-stained face in his hands. "But I believe," he said fiercely, "I believe that you will live. I believe that you will both live. It should have been happy, and I ruined it," she whispered, her eyes welling with tears again. "Enough of that," he soothed her, rubbing the pads of his thumbs against her cheeks to wipe away her falling tears. "I wish you had just told me, Ursula." His voice was pained, and she could see the regret in his eyes. "I didn't know how," she responded, and he sighed heavily, before tugging her closer and pressing his lips to her forehead. "I shouldn't have got angry with you, I should have known there was something wrong. I'm sorry," he whispered against her. "You had every right to be angry," she whispered back, her hands coming to clench around his forearms. "I know it must be overwhelming," he said, "but would you please promise to talk to me when it all gets too much? Even if you think you're being foolish. I want to know when you're afraid, Ursula. I want to be there to try and make things better. I promise," she said. It was all she could manage, her words trembling again. "Hush now, come on." He pulled her back into his arms, and she leant against him, her arms tight around his waist as he rocked her slightly and murmured soothing things for what felt like forever. "Are you certain?" he finally murmured, and she opened her now dry eyes. "About the baby," he elaborated, and she couldn't help but smile at the word on his lips. "I am now," she whispered, the maester confirmed it. She was almost crushed in his embrace in response, and she choked out a little laugh. "I'm not sure you holding me this tightly is good for my health," she told him, and his grip slackened at once, though he made no move to release her. "What is good for your health?" He pulled back so he could look down and meet her eyes. "Did the maester say? Ought you to be resting, or?" She cut him off by standing up on her toes and pressing her lips to his. "The maester said that I am perfectly well, and I can continue on as normal. I only need to make sure I am careful on the snow." She smiled up at him, seeing the relief in his eyes. "I cannot believe this is happening," he said incredulously after a moment. "I have wanted this for so long. The people have been waiting for this for so long." Her smile dropped slightly at that, and he clearly noticed a little frown coming to crease his brow. "What is it?" he asked, and she reached up to caress his cheek gently. "I know you must want to tell the world," she said, "but you have to promise you won't, not yet. The maester said it is best not to make any announcements until I feel the child stir, lest it be lost." "Then I suppose we must obey the maester," he sighed, looking slightly disappointed. She nodded her agreement, and he leant his forehead down to rest against hers. "Will you tell me, when you feel it?" he asked her almost shyly, and she nodded at once. "Of course I will," she promised him, and he pressed another kiss to her forehead. "Thank you," he murmured, and she knew from his tone that he was thanking her for more than her assurance that she would tell him. She could think of no more words, and so she just settled for taking hold of his hand and moving to lay on her stomach. His smile made his eyes light up almost boyishly, and tears of happiness were stinging at her eyes in response. "Don't think I don't want this," she whispered. "I swear, I am proud to be carrying your child, Rob." Over the next days the confirmation that she was indeed expecting a child was better sinking into Ursula. It was hard to worry about everything that could potentially go wrong when she saw just how happy the news had made Rob. He was in such good cheer that she was afraid that those closest to him might begin to get suspicious. Thankfully no one had said a word, and she could only imagine that they assumed him happy because he had returned home. That was what made Ursula happiest of all. Knowing that he was home, and would now be here for the duration of the winter, no matter what word came from outside. There would be no question of him leaving now. While the snows were not yet impassable, they soon would be, and the temperatures were far too cold to be exposed to the elements at night. No. He would be here now until spring decided to rear its head. Meaning it was more than likely that he would be here with her until the baby came, all being well. She was glad of that. Glad that he would be here to see her grow and change, to reassure her when all her fears came bubbling up to the surface again. They still resided within her. She was still afraid that she would never feel the child stir. That she would bleed. She was afraid that even if she didn't, that the precious little thing would be snatched from her by winter's cruel hands. Ursula knew the stories. She knew that mothers would smother their babies in their cradles rather than have them starve or freeze to death. Rob had told her to put that from her mind, that those were stories of desperate small folk trapped away from any great settlement. It would not be like that for them, that's what he promised her. Winterfell would always be warm inside, no matter how deep the snows fell, or how low the temperatures dropped. It was hard not to believe him when he was curled around her under their mountain of furs. His breath was warm on the back of her shoulder as he continued to sleep soundly. Dawn hadn't come yet, though it seemed to come later and later each day. The sun would never be up for long anymore, and even when it was up it was weak. Rarely did it break through the near-constant cloud. It could never be described as shining brightly anymore, all it served to do was cast a dim half-light over Winterfell for a few hours each day. Rob shifted a little in his sleep, the arm that was draped carelessly across her hip tightening a little. She pressed herself further back against him at the movement, shuffling herself down under the furs until she was leaning against his chest, her head tucked under his chin. He murmured in half-sleep, his hand slipping over her waist and splaying across her stomach. It was there it came to rest often now, such a softness in his eyes that it was a wonder to behold. Seeing it made it hard to believe that he was the same man who had once confessed to her that he was unsure if he had it in him to love their children. Rob loved his child already. She could see it in his eyes. He was desperate for this. Both he and the North had been waiting a long time for an heir. For over 8 years he had been king, 8 years of waiting for her and waiting for an heir. Gods, she hoped it would all come good, her own hand coming to lay across his as he let out a shuddering breath and a groan. She couldn't help but smile at his clear reluctance to wake up. Rob was usually the first to wake, and didn't protest all that much about leaving the warmth of their bed. Since he had returned from Long Lake though, he had been far more reluctant to slip from beneath the furs in the morning. Not that she could blame him. If she had had to spend that long out in the open then she would likely have missed a real bed more than anything else too. Rob huffed in the next moment, before he somehow curled himself more closely around her, burying his head in the crook of her neck. "Morning, husband," she said in an amused tone as he nuzzled against her for a moment. "Morning, wife," he returned, his voice thick with sleep but still laced with slight amusement. "How long have you been awake?" he asked her groggily, and she shrugged her shoulder. "A little while, I suppose," she answered him, and he hummed, pressing a kiss to her shoulder before he rolled away to stretch himself properly awake. She rolled onto her own back, turning her head so she could contemplate him, seeing his eyes still clouded with sleep. "You have been a lazy husband these past days," she told him teasingly, and he grinned, turning his head towards her and blinking slowly. "I think you mean, you have been too irresistible to tear myself away from," he corrected her, and she couldn't help but giggle. "I've missed that," he told her seriously, rolling onto his side and looking down on her. "Are you feeling better?" he asked, his eyes searching her features. "I am," she confirmed to him. "I do not think my fears will ever truly disappear, but I am far happier now." "Good," he said, holding her eyes for a long moment before he bent his head down to kiss her. She kissed him back gladly, her hand moving up to trail along the arm he was using to prop himself up, as his own hand wound its way into her hair. He pulled back too soon, and she huffed in irritation, to which he merely grinned once more. "You are the one who pointed out how lazy I've been, now you don't want me to get out of bed." He quirked his brow and she bit down on her bottom lip. "Just stay a little longer," she used her most persuasive tone, holding his eyes and hoping he would snuggle back down with her. "Fine," he tried to sound exasperated, but she could hear the amusement in his tone as he wrapped his arms around her and pulled her against his chest. His lips found her forehead as she nestled herself against him, savoring the soft warmth of his close proximity. All the furs in the world could never compare to Rob. Ursula believed that she could sleep under the thinnest blankets and still be warm so long as she was secured in his arms. Slowly she traced her fingers over the scars left by the dragon's talons, running them along each smooth, white line. Rob exhaled deeply as she progressed, his own fingertips whispering down her back before he began to curl a lock of her hair around his fingers. "Do you think anyone would miss us if we stayed up here all day?" she asked him with a sigh. "And what would we do up here all day?" he asked her in a rather suggestive manner, which had her smiling at once. "Whatever we pleased," she answered him, shifting a little closer and pressing a kiss to his scarred shoulder. It is tempting." Rob's voice was laced with satisfaction, "but I have yet to see the accounts since I returned, and I promised the steward I would give them my full attention. Not to mention, you need to eat, and I cannot imagine you lasting a whole day without any of your warm, spiced milk." She giggled again at that. Rob was right, she did not think she would manage the day without her milk. She could only imagine that it was the baby that had increased her appetite for it. The maester had thought it likely too when she had asked him about it. Rob mentioning food had also drawn her attention to the fact that her stomach was on the verge of snarling in protest. She groaned, and Rob kissed the top of her head in response. "Hungry?" he asked her knowingly, and she nodded against him, earning another kiss. "I could have them bring breakfast to you," he murmured, "that way you will not have to worry about reacting badly to the bacon again. If you come over ill in front of the others they will start to ask questions, and you know what my mother is like." "That's likely a good idea," Ursula agreed with him. Since that morning they had dined up here together, and thankfully none of the family had thought it strange. "I cannot dine up here forever though," she grumbled, "they will notice eventually and start asking questions." Rob hummed his agreement, his hands smoothing through her hair. "No doubt," he spoke after a few moments, "though, if I ban bacon from the breakfast table then Arya is going to be an absolute nightmare. Awkward questions will be the least of my worries, believe me." Chapter 25, XXII, Invisible Scares. Notes. Hey guys. New chapter for you all, thanks so much for all the kudos, you're amazing. Thanks too, to Thistle, for reading all in one go, hope you carry on enjoying. And, Kinginth North, great name, thanks to you too, I'm afraid you'll have to be patient just a little longer to find out what Jamie is up to. Anyway, hope you all enjoy this new one. Happy Smiley. Chapter text. Rob. If he had ever been happier, he could not remember it. Despite the winter settling in around them and the temperatures constantly freezing, he had never felt warmer. Though there were things for him to worry about every day, when he was up here in this chamber with her, he could easily forget it all. The burdens of kingship all just fell away from him as soon as he stepped through the door. His wife stayed up here more often than not now, sewing and reading to occupy herself. She felt the cold more than the others, even more so than his mother. Even just walking down to the entrance hall would have her shivering. Whenever she did venture down for dinner he would have to ensure that she was well wrapped up in a cloak and furs. At first it had worried him, but the maester had come to check on her and assured him that she was in perfect health. Both her and the baby. He smiled widely as ever he did when he thought of the new life growing inside her. Even the dull task of looking over the accounts could not dampen his high spirits. The coffers were looking healthy from what he had seen so far anyway, and he reclined back in his chair, exhaling deeply in satisfaction. It had been nearly a moon since he had returned home from dispatching the deserter, and despite the worsening weather, everything seemed to be running well around him. Personally, he did not think he could ask for any more. Behind him he heard Ursula begin to stir, and he turned in his chair slightly so he could watch her rouse from her sleep. He had already laid his robe out on the side of the bed he had vacated, just ready for her to slip herself into when she woke. She opened her eyes in the next moment, her hands coming to them to rub the sleep from them. He smiled at her when she noticed him, and she returned the gesture lazily before stretching herself out. "Morning, you," he said softly. "Hard at work again?" she asked him, stifling a yawn, and he hummed his agreement. "A king's work is never done," he said teasingly, turning his eyes back to the accounts ledger he had been reading through. He could hear Ursula shuffling behind him, no doubt getting herself up and out of bed. "Do you need anything?" he asked her absently. "I'm fine," she responded. "Did I miss breakfast?" "Yes, but I left you plenty," he answered her, and she thanked him. A moment later he heard the pull of a chair against the floor, and he could only assume she had settled herself at the table to eat. Despite often feeling nauseous during the morning hours, she still had a healthy appetite, and he was glad of it. It was even more important for her to keep her strength up now she was with child, especially with it expected to be a winter baby. He reached the end of the month in the next moment, dipping his quill into the ink pot before signing the bottom of the ledger so Byrne would know he had cast his eye over it and been satisfied. Their coffers were healthy indeed, even with the coin he had set aside for the builders. He sighed in contentment before setting his quill aside and rising up from the desk. Ursula smiled as he approached where she was sat breaking her fast, and he returned the gesture easily. "Do you want me to call for anything else? More milk, perhaps?" he asked her, taking the seat opposite her as she swallowed down her mouthful. "I'm fine," honestly she assured him, fixing him with a look for a moment that he could almost describe as conflicted. It had him worried at once. "What is it?" he asked her. "There's nothing wrong, is there?" "No, of course not," she soothed him at once, reaching her hand across the table to caress his. She bit down on her lip. "I'm not certain, but I think I felt it move, the baby, I mean." "Truly?" His eyes brightened, and her hand squeezed his in response. "Like I said, I'm not certain," she said in an amused tone, "but I felt something, and I have never felt it before. So, I suppose it must be the baby." "What does it feel like?" he asked her curiously, and she smiled. "Like fluttering, I suppose," she answered him, "just so light you can barely notice it." "But you have noticed it," he grinned at her, and her own smile widened as she nodded happily. "Gods, Ursula, you have no idea how happy this is making me." "I think I do," she said, her eyes finding his. "You have been full of joy for nigh on a moon now. I'm surprised no one has grown suspicious yet, the way you have been wandering around the place with such a spring in your step." "All thanks to you," he said, lifting her hand gently to his lips and pressing a kiss to the back of it. "Well, you helped." She raised a brow, and he smirked at her. "I remember," he said, raising his own brows slightly, "it was my utmost pleasure." "As it was mine," she returned, and he pressed another kiss to the back of her hand. "Careful," he warned her in a teasing tone, "you have only just risen, and if you do not control that tongue of yours I shall have to demand you return to bed." "Well, I am your queen," she said suggestively. "It is my duty to heed my husband's demands." He was about to respond, but a knock came at the door before he could suggest that they did indeed return to bed. With a huff he regretfully let go of her hand and rose up from the table. Byrne stood on the other side of the door when he opened it, and Rob raised a brow expectantly. "Is there a problem?" he asked the steward. "Not at all, Your Grace, forgive me." He bowed his head slightly. "I have merely come to ask if I can take the accounts ledger. Your lady mother wanted to look over the expense of the household. I believe she has a few ideas to help cut some costs during the winter." "Very well," Rob said, moving from the door and to the desk to pick up the ledger. "I have finished with it anyway, Byrne. All was in order from what I observed. We appear to be comfortably making coin." "Yes, Your Grace." Byrne inclined his head as Rob approached him again with the ledger. "My apologies again for disturbing you, Your Grace, my queen." He bobbed his head towards him and Ursula in turn before backing from the room and closing the door firmly behind him. "Well, his timing couldn't have been any better," Rob said dryly, and Ursula giggled as he moved back towards the desk to tidy away the quills and ink. "You have a letter here, did you forget about it?" Rob asked her as he opened the drawer and found a lion seal staring up at him. By the gods, I must have done. Ursula scraped back her chair at once. I put it away in case it was from my mother, she explained as she came towards him, and he frowned. It arrived the day I received word from you that you were coming home, she continued, laying her hand on the small of his back, and I didn't want to sour my good mood, not when I know what her letters usually contain. Rob couldn't help but smile at that, just at the simple fact that she had been pleased that he was coming home. It might not be from her, he said, trying to keep his tone casual. Talk of Circe was never at the top of his agenda, but she was Ursula's mother and there would be no changing that. He had always determined never to speak ill of her family in his wife's presence, though it was often tested when he saw just how much her mother's wrong assumptions got to her. Well, it is not from Tommen, as I have corresponded with him since, Ursula said, fingering at the seal of the letter. I can always hope it is from my uncle Tyrion, but I will not hold my breath. He is so busy at the Rock he barely finds time to write. Unfortunately for me, it seems as though my mother has far too much time on her hands. You won't know unless you open it, Rob said, squeezing his hand around her upper arm for a moment. She smiled faintly in response, before taking a deep breath and snapping the seal. He watched her reaction, seeing her brow furrow. What is it? He asked after a moment, as her frown only seemed to sink deeper into her forehead. I don't understand, she said, shaking her head before raising her eyes from the parchment to meet his. What do you suppose she means by it? She asked him, offering him the letter. Rob took it grudgingly. He had no desire to know what Cersei Lannister meant by anything, but he could not ignore Ursula's confusion. His own brow furrowed as he took in the length of the letter. It was but a few lines, and he could make no more sense of them than Ursula seemingly could. It will be over soon, darling. Stay strong just a little while longer. It will be over soon. Your marriage to me, he raised a brow and smirked slightly. Ursula didn't seem to find it funny, her cheeks draining of color as she snatched the letter back out of his hands and read the lines again. He could see her lips forming the words as she read it over and over. Ursula, I'm sure it's fine, he soothed her, rubbing his hand up and down her back. She could mean anything by it, winter, perhaps. Or perhaps you were right the first time, she said fearfully, her knuckles white where she was holding on so tightly to the parchment. What if she has sent someone, Rob? What if she has someone here already? Gods, she clasped her other hand to her mouth. What if she means to harm you? To kill you? Her voice was trembling now, her eyes shining with tears. Stop this, he urged her at once, pulling her into his arms. She cannot touch me here, even if she wanted to. Do you not think anyone passing through the gates in this weather who was unknown would not be greeted with suspicion? The guards know everyone, Ursula. If they saw anyone suspicious they would come right to me. I know who is in my service, and I trust them all. Your mother has no way of buying any of them. Nothing is going to happen to me, I promise. You don't know what she's like, what she's capable of, Ursula said in an agonized tone, and he frowned at her. What do you mean? He asked, and she shook her head. I shouldn't have said that, she gabbled out. I don't know anything for sure, it was just whispers. Whispers about what? He pressed her. Whispers that she was behind my father's death, she confessed so quietly he had to strain to hear her. That wasn't an accident at all. That she arranged for it all to happen, she tailed off, looking utterly terrified. Even if that were true, it was done at the capital where she has people willing to do her bidding, Rob told her calmly. She does not have people here to do such a thing. Now will you please try and calm yourself? You know what the maester said, stress and worry is bad for the baby. He pulled back from her slightly at that, moving his hand to rest on her stomach. There was the slightest of change in her now, the merest hint of roundness beneath his touch. She moved her hand to lay atop his, her cheeks still pale but her brow no longer creased. You're right, she finally said, and he breathed a sigh of relief. Of course you're right, there is no way she could hope to get to you here, not now that winter is set in again. We don't even know that that's what she was talking about, she shook her head. She could have meant anything. She could have been drunk. I'm sorry, Rob, it's just the thought of anything happening to you. Of losing you, He cut her off with a kiss, working his lips softly with hers for a long moment. You don't have to apologize, he murmured when he finally pulled back. I know how you feel. Remember the state I was in over that stupid dream. All because I couldn't bear the thought of you not being here with me always. We have years ahead of us, many happy years. Now, forget this letter and relax. He rubbed his hand against her stomach. All I want is for you to be calm and rested, leave the worrying to everyone else. She was sewing what looked like a blanket when he returned from council. He had let himself in quietly in case she were sleeping, and so consequently she had not heard him come in. There was such a look of concentration on her face as she worked, and he stood and admired her for a long moment. She was sat by the fire, and the way the flames illuminated the golden strands of her hair was more captivating than he had words to describe. Still she hadn't noticed him, and so he approached slowly, his hand coming to stroke down her cheek as he moved behind her chair. Almost at once she flinched, pulling back from his touch. When her eyes met his they were wide and panicked, and he could see from the rise and fall of her chest that her heart was pounding wildly in her chest. "It's all right," he soothed, kneeling down at the side of her chair. "It's just me, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to frighten you." "I know," she said weakly, "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you come in." "It's my fault," he said, his hand coming to rest on her knee. "I should have said something, you just looked so perfect I couldn't resist." She smiled in response to that, but he could still see the lingering fear in her eyes. His own eyes darted to her hands, and she could see that her left hand was clenched tightly. He moved his hand to take it, gently prizing her fingers away from her palms. "I reminded you of something, didn't I?" He raised his eyes to hers, and she nodded slowly. "I'm sorry," he said again, rubbing his thumb firmly against the back of her hand. "You weren't to know," she said, smiling for him again. "Do you want to tell me about it?" he asked her tentatively, and she clearly took a shuddering breath. "You don't have to," he said quickly. "If you would prefer not to, then I understand. I'll just make sure never to sneak up on you again." She laughed a little shakily at that, and he smiled, still rubbing his thumb soothingly against the back of her hand. "Would you hold me for a little while?" she asked him almost shyly, and he was nodding his agreement at once. She slipped her hand from his grasp in response, carefully setting aside her sewing before she rose up to her feet. Rob settled himself on the sofa in front of the fire, shifting himself so she could lean back against him. She moved to do just that, and he wrapped his arms tightly around her before settling his hands on her stomach. One of her own hands came to settle on one of his, the other stroking up and down his forearm. Rob exhaled in contentment, pressing a kiss to the top of her golden head. "It was Joffrey," she said almost in response to his action, and if it were possible he tightened his hold on her even more. He was unsurprised at her confession, but it didn't make it any easier to stomach. "What did he do?" he murmured against the top of her head, strands of her hair tickling against his lips as he spoke. She didn't speak up at once, her hand gently playing with his fingers. Rob waited, unwilling to push her. He could tell this was hard for her, and he determined that he would not make it any more difficult. "He had been bullying Tommen again," she finally spoke up, "and I was trying to stop him, only he was worse than he usually was and he wasn't listening to me. So, in the end I couldn't stand it anymore, so I threw one of Tommen's toy soldiers at him. It cut just above his eye, and I was so certain he would turn on me right away, but he didn't. He ran away. Likely to tell Mother." Her tone was bitter, but he stayed quiet, knowing she wasn't finished. "I was terrified of getting into trouble, so I went and hid in the library," she continued. "I was there for hours, but I should have known Joffrey would find me in the end." Again she paused, and Rob remained silent, waiting. "He told me that when he was king he would punish me," her voice was trembling, "that he would send me away to marry a man who would keep me in order. He even threatened to give me to the mountain. I should have said nothing, I should have just let him say his cruel words, but I couldn't stop myself. I told him he would not be king for years," she went on. "I told him that father would find a good match for me, and that I would be glad to be away from him when the time came. I told him that he would be a terrible king, and that he would be despised by the people. That's when he pulled out the knife. It was only a short thing, thin and silver. I don't know where he got it from, but it was enough to shut me up. He put it to my cheek, and I was so terrified that I couldn't move, couldn't even cry out for help." Her voice broke a little, her nails pinching ever so slightly into the back of his hand. Again, he pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and she took a shuddering breath. "He said he would be king soon enough," her voice trembled, "and that he would make sure no man would ever love me." He said that I was pretty enough now, but that no man would ever want a scarred bride. I was so sure he would cut me. That he would scar my face, but he didn't. He put the blade away and warned me never to cross him again. But you still continued to shield Tommen from him. Rob guessed quietly, and she nodded. I could never have left him to Joffrey's cruelty, she said, shaking her head. I would never have been able to forgive myself. Joffrey was already determined he would make me pay, so there was not much I could do to make it worse. You know, I was so certain that he had managed to keep his promise from beyond the grave when it was agreed that I would marry you. I never dreamed that you and I would ever be happy. I was so sure that Joffrey had taken his final revenge somehow. I confess I imagined the same, he said quietly, but I swear to you now, Myrcella, your brother was wrong. He paid the price for his cruelty, and you are free of him. He can never hurt you again, I promise you. I know, she said, her voice sounding a little thick. You were brave standing up to him, saying what you did, Rob told her, lacing his finger with hers. Stupid, more like, she snorted slightly. They were naive words from the mouth of a child. I was wrong. Father was not king for years to come. He was dead within the month. Though at least when Joffrey was made king his attention was pulled from tormenting Tommen and I as much. You weren't stupid, Rob soothed her, and you were right about one thing. What's that? She asked him curiously, and he couldn't help but grin. He was a terrible king, he answered, despised by the people. I suppose you're right, she giggled slightly, squeezing his hand a little. You know he can't hurt you anymore, he told her seriously, pressing his lips to the top of her head firmly. No one can hurt you anymore, I won't let them. I know, she whispered back to him, squeezing his hand again. And I thank the gods for it every day, Rob. I never imagined that we could ever be this happy. That you could ever care for me the way you do. She slipped her hand away from him at that, and before he could respond she was turning carefully in his arms so she could prop herself up against his chest and meet his eyes. I thought the same, he told her honestly. You know I did. I have never hidden it from you. For years I kept you buried at the back of my mind, but as the time grew closer to you coming here I only grew to dread it more. I wanted anyone but you, he shook his head, and she smiled slightly. It's not like that anymore, he whispered, lifting his hand to tuck a lock of her hair back behind her ear. It has not been like that for a long time. You mean the world to me, Myrcella, don't ever doubt that. I don't, she responded, shaking her head slightly before holding his eyes fast once more. He knew she had her mother's eyes. Knew that everything about her appearance was pure Lannister. Inside though, inside she could not be more different. She was soft and warm, and did not have a conniving or cruel bone in her body. Her eyes may be the shade of her mother's, the very same shape and size, but they held a warmth within them that Cersei Lannister could never hope to have. I love you, he told her quietly before he could second-guess himself. Her eyes widened in response, a completely disbelieving look on her face. She pushed herself up further against his chest so that she could look down on him. He held his eyes on her face, silently begging for her to believe him. Somehow he knew it must have been hard for her to hear the words. Somehow he imagined that they had not been uttered to her many times in her life. That clenched his heart hard. A woman like Myrcella should only be adored, never hurt or shamed the way she had been at the capital. Nor dreaded and dismissed as she had been by him at the beginning. He would never dismiss her again, he promised himself that as he looked into her disbelieving eyes. Truly, she asked him, and he nodded his confirmation. She smiled then, but it was a smile that seemed almost tinged with sadness. It was a smile that had him wanting to pull her into his arms and never let go ever again. Oh, Rob, her eyes were shining. I'm not sure I have ever been sure what that truly meant. It means losing you would kill me, he told her. It means you have made my life better just by being in it. You make every day better, Myrcella. I adore you. I adore simply being in your presence. I love the way you laugh, the way you smile, the way you raise one brow at me when you read my baser intentions all too easily. I need you. Your kiss. Your touch. Everything. That's what it means, Myrcella. That's what loving you means to me. If that's what it means, she whispered, her hands coming to cup around his cheeks. If that is truly what it means, then I know beyond all doubt that I feel the same for you, Rob. I love you too. Chapter 26, 23, Unwelcome. Notes. Sorry to have kept you waiting with this one folks, been a busy time in reality for me. Anyway, I want to thank you all for your lovely comments. I'm up to 100, yeah. I still can't believe how much people are enjoying this, and I appreciate the encouragement so much. I'm glad you all enjoyed the declaration of love, or seemed to anyway. Hope you enjoy this new chapter. Also, thank you everyone for the kudos, it's so wonderful of you and I can't believe I have nearly 700. Just, wow. Right, I will shut up now and let you get on. Hope you enjoy. Happy Smiley. Chapter text. Ursula. He told her every day now. Each and every day, and each time it still sounded like